This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I was so excited when we first moved into the old house on Ashwood Street. It was a beautiful Victorian-style home from the 1930s, with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows. My husband Owen and I had been searching for the perfect place to raise our two kids, 8-year-old Lily and 5-year-old Max. This house seemed like a dream come true, spacious, full of character, and in a quiet neighborhood with great schools nearby. The first few weeks went by uneventfully as we settled in and unpacked. The kids loved exploring all the nooks and crannies of the old house. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found such a gem. If only I had known then what horrors awaited us. It all started after we returned from a New Year's trip to visit my parents. At first, it was just little things that seemed odd but easy to explain away. A shirt I could have sworn I'd just washed would suddenly be missing from the laundry pile, only to reappear folded in my dresser drawer the next day. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness and the chaos of unpacking from our trip. But then stranger things began happening. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I distinctly heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the attic above. My heart started racing as I realized Owen and the kids were all downstairs. I called out, thinking maybe Owen had gone up there without me noticing, but there was no response. When I went to investigate, the attic was empty and undisturbed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the old house settling or pipes knocking. But deep down, a feeling of unease had taken root. I found myself jumping at every creak and groan of the floorboards. A few days later, Lily came running into our room in the middle of the night, crying that she had seen a shadow person standing in the corner of her bedroom. I comforted her and told her it was just a bad dream, but her words sent a chill down my spine. That same night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and noticed all the lights in the hallway were on, even though I distinctly remembered turning them off before bed. The incidents kept escalating. Doors would slam shut on their own when there wasn't even a breeze. We'd hear muffled voices and whispers coming from empty rooms. The worst was when objects would move on their own. I once watched in horror as a glass slowly slid across the kitchen counter and crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces. Owen tried to stay skeptical at first, always looking for logical explanations, but even he couldn't deny the strange energy that had taken over our home. The kids were constantly on edge, afraid to be alone in their rooms. Lily had started wetting the bed again, something she hadn't done since she was a toddler. I remember the night things came to a head so vividly. We were all sitting down to dinner, trying to have a normal family meal, despite the tension in the air. Suddenly, we heard it, loud, deliberate footsteps coming from directly above us. It sounded like someone was slowly pacing back and forth across the ceiling. Owen jumped up from the table, his face pale. "That's it. I'm going up there to see what the hell is going on," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "No, don't leave us," Lily cried, clinging to my arm. Max had started sobbing uncontrollably. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more frantic. It sounded like whoever, or whatever, was up there was running now, racing from one end of the attic to the other. The lights in the dining room began to flicker ominously. Just as Owen reached for the attic door, an ear-splitting shriek pierced the air. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, but filled with rage and anguish. The entire house seemed to shake. In that moment, something in me snapped. "We need to get out of here now," I yelled, grabbing the kids and rushing towards the front door. Owen didn't argue, following close behind. We piled into the car in our pajamas, not even stopping to grab shoes or coats. As we peeled out of the driveway, I looked back at the house. For a split second, I swear I saw a dark figure standing in the upstairs window watching us leave. We spent that night in a hotel, shell-shocked and trying to process what had happened. The next day, Owen went back to the house alone to grab some essentials, while the kids and I waited anxiously in the car. He said everything seemed normal in the light of day, but he felt an oppressive heaviness as soon as he stepped inside. We never returned to live in that house. Owen's brother helped us move our belongings out over the next few weeks. We told the neighbors we were leaving due to a job transfer, too embarrassed and scared to share the real reason. It's been almost a year now since we fled Ashwood Street, but the memories of that place still haunt me. I have vivid nightmares where I'm trapped in the house, desperately trying to escape as an unseen presence closes in. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom smell of smoke lingering in my nostrils. We've heard rumors that the new owners have experienced strange occurrences too. Part of me wants to warn them, to tell them to get out while they still can. But who would believe such an insane story? I still don't have any logical explanation for what we endured in that house. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, darker and more terrifying than we can imagine. That house on Ashwood Street opened my eyes to a reality I wish I could forget. Even now, writing this out makes my hands shake. I keep looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure from the window. I don't know if we'll ever truly be free from whatever malevolent force inhabited that house. All I can do is hold my family close and pray that the nightmares will eventually fade. But deep down, I know the truth. Some houses are born bad, and the evil that dwells within them never truly dies. I just hope and pray that no other unsuspecting family falls victim to the horrors that await behind that innocent-looking Victorian facade on Ashwood Street. I was looking for some peace and quiet, a chance to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life. That's why I decided to rent a remote cabin up in the mountains for a week. Just me, my two loyal dogs, Scout and Bramble, and the great outdoors. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to relax, do some fishing, and clear my head. The first couple days were exactly what I hoped for. The cabin was cozy but well-equipped, nestled in a picturesque valley with snow-capped peaks in the distance. A large frozen lake stretched out in front of the property, promising good ice fishing. Scout and Bramble were in heaven, bounding through the snow and chasing each other around the yard. I spent my time chopping firewood, reading by the fireplace, and taking long walks through the silent forest with the dogs. At night, I'd sit out on the porch bundled up in blankets, marveling at the vast canopy of stars overhead. The peace and solitude were intoxicating after months of stress and overtime at work. On the third day, I decided to try my hand at ice fishing. I gathered up my gear, called the dogs, and headed out onto the frozen lake. The ice was thick and solid under my feet. I found a good spot about 50 yards from shore and started drilling a hole. Scout and Bramble ran circles around me, sliding across the slick surface and barking excitedly. As I was setting up my gear, I noticed how eerily quiet it had gotten. The constant background noise of birds and small animals that I'd grown accustomed to had vanished. Even the wind seemed to have died down completely. Scout and Bramble had stopped playing and were sitting tensely at attention, ears perked up. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling and focus on fishing. After about an hour with no bites, I was about to pack it in when my line suddenly went taut. I reeled furiously, feeling the weight of a big catch. When I finally pulled it up through the hole, I nearly dropped my rod in shock. The fish was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, with milky white eyes that seemed to stare right through me. But the most disturbing part was the mass of writhing worms, visibly squirming under its skin and bursting out of lesions all over its body. I quickly cut the line and kicked it back down the hole, thoroughly disgusted. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Scout and Bramble were restless, pacing around the cabin and growling softly at the windows. I tried to convince myself it was just typical animal behavior in an unfamiliar environment, but a nagging sense of dread had settled in the pit of my stomach. I must have dozed off eventually, because I was jolted awake in the early hours by a blood-curdling howl that seemed to shake the entire cabin. Scout and Bramble were going berserk, barking frantically and scratching at the door. Heart pounding, I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and cautiously approached the window. The full moon illuminated the snowy landscape outside, casting long shadows across the yard. At first I didn't see anything amiss. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye at the tree line. I trained my flashlight on the spot and felt the blood drain from my face. A massive, dark shape was moving through the trees with unnatural speed and agility. It was hard to make out details, but it seemed vaguely humanoid in form, only much larger, at least 8 feet tall. As it passed between two trees, I caught a glimpse of pale, elongated limbs and what looked like antlers protruding from its head. I stumbled back from the window in shock, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. I must be having some kind of vivid nightmare. But the frenzied barking of my dogs and the lingering echo of that unearthly howl told me this was all too real. For the next few hours, I huddled in the center of the cabin with Scout and Bramble, my rifle clutched tightly to my chest. Strange noises drifted in from outside, heavy footsteps crunching in the snow, eerie vocalizations that were neither human nor animal, the sound of trees groaning and snapping. Several times dark shapes passed by the windows, always just out of clear sight. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, things finally quieted down outside. I waited another hour to be sure, then quickly packed up my essential gear. There was no way I was staying another night in this godforsaken place. I loaded up the truck as fast as I could, all while scanning the tree line nervously. Scout and Bramble seemed eager to leave as well, whining anxiously and pacing by the vehicle. Just as I was doing a final sweep of the cabin, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Massive tracks in the snow led right up to the porch and circled the entire cabin. They were easily twice the size of my boot prints, with long claw marks at the ends of the toes. Whatever had made them was no normal animal. I slammed the cabin door shut and sprinted for the truck. As I was pulling away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and could have sworn I saw a tall, antlered silhouette watching from the edge of the forest. I gunned the engine and didn't slow down until I hit the main highway hours later. It's been weeks since that terrifying night, but I still have trouble sleeping. I find myself jumping at small noises and constantly looking over my shoulder. Scout and Bramble seem on edge too, growling at shadows and refusing to go outside after dark. I've tried researching local folklore and cryptids from that area, but haven't found anything conclusive. Part of me wants to go back with a team to investigate further. but a larger part knows that some things are better left alone. Whatever inhabits those remote mountains is not meant for human understanding. I count myself lucky to have escaped with my life, and I won't tempt fate again. So if you're ever looking for a secluded cabin getaway, my advice is to stick to popular, well-traveled areas. There are things lurking in the deep wilderness that defy explanation, things that view humans as nothing more than prey. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. I was in desperate need of a break from the chaos of city life, so I decided to treat myself to a luxurious stay at an exclusive lodge nestled high in the Alps. As soon as I arrived, I felt the tension melting away. The crisp mountain air, the pristine blanket of snow stretching as far as the eye could see. It was like stepping into a winter wonderland. The first few days were absolute bliss. I spent my mornings carving fresh tracks down perfectly groomed ski runs, marveling at how effortlessly I glided through the powder. In the afternoons, I'd relax in the outdoor hot tub, letting the warm water soothe my muscles as I gazed out at the majestic snow-capped peaks surrounding me. Evenings were spent cozied up by a roaring fire in the lodge's grand stone fireplace, sipping hot cocoa and losing myself in a good book. It was everything I had hoped for and more. On the fourth day of my stay, I decided to explore some of the lodge's common areas that I hadn't checked out yet. As I wandered through a quiet hallway lined with framed vintage photos, one image in particular caught my eye. It was a black and white group shot, probably from the 1920s or 30s, showing a bunch of smiling guests posed out front of the lodge. But there was something off about it. In the back row, partially obscured by the others, was a man who didn't quite fit. While everyone else was dressed in the fashions of the era, he wore what looked like modern ski gear, a puffy jacket and pants that seemed out of place. His face was blurry, as if he had moved right as the photo was taken. I leaned in closer, squinting to try and make out his features. A chill ran down my spine as I realized his gaze seemed to be looking directly at the camera, at me. I shook my head, telling myself I was just seeing things. Lack of sleep from all the fresh air and exercise, probably. I continued on with my day, hitting the slopes for a few more runs before heading back to my room to get ready for dinner. As I was changing, movement outside my balcony caught my eye. I froze, watching as a dark figure walked slowly across the snow, heading straight for my room. My heart began to race as I realized it was a man dressed exactly like the one from the old photo. Same puffy jacket, same blurry face. He stopped directly in front of my balcony and slowly raised his head to look right at me. I stumbled backwards, fumbling for my phone to call the front desk. But by the time I looked back up, he was gone. Vanished, leaving no footprints in the fresh snow. My hands shaking, I called down to report what I'd seen. The staff was very accommodating, sending security to do a thorough check of the grounds. They found nothing out of the ordinary. I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. That night I tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. Every creak of the old lodge made me jump. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, 3 sharp knocks on my door. I lay frozen in bed, hardly daring to breathe. Then came a voice, muffled but clear. "Let me in, I've been waiting so long." I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to be a dream. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "I know you're in there. I saw you earlier. Let me in." The doorknob began to rattle. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear before I finally worked up the courage to inch out of bed and peer through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the armchair by the door, every muscle tense, jumping at the slightest sound. As soon as the first rays of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I threw my belongings haphazardly into my suitcase and practically ran to check out. The woman at the front desk seemed concerned by my frazzled state, asking if everything was all right. I muttered some excuse about a family emergency requiring me to leave early. As she processed my checkout, she handed me an envelope. "Oh, I almost forgot. This was left for you last night, a little souvenir of your stay with us." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a copy of that old group photo I had seen in the hallway. But this one was different. The blurry man in the back was in sharp focus now, his face clearly visible. It was me. I dropped the photo like it had burned me and bolted for the door, not even bothering to grab my receipt. I didn't breathe easy until I was in my car, speeding down the winding mountain road away from that place. It's been months now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, hearing those knocks on my door. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was all just a vivid, stress-induced hallucination. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure in a puffy jacket, watching me from across a crowded street or reflected in a store window, and that icy fear grips me all over again. I don't know what happened up there in that lodge. I don't know who or what that man was, or why he seemed so fixated on me. All I know is that I'll never set foot in the mountains again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've debated for a long time whether to share this experience. Part of me worried people would think I was crazy, but I finally decided to post it here, hoping that maybe someone else has encountered something similar. If nothing else, maybe getting it off my chest will help me finally move past it. Has anyone else had strange experiences in secluded mountain lodges? Ever felt like you were being watched by something that shouldn't be there? I'd love to hear your stories. Anything to make me feel less alone in this. For now, I'm sticking to beach vacations. Sand and sun seem a lot less likely to hide dark secrets than snow and silence. If you're planning a ski trip anytime soon, well, just be careful. And maybe think twice before looking too closely at any old photos you come across. I was just a kid when I first met Jesse Calloway. It was during recess on a snowy winter day at Lincoln Elementary. Most of the other kids were huddled inside by the radiators, but not Jesse. He was out there in the thick of it, rolling massive snowballs for what looked like the world's biggest snowman. I remember being drawn to his enthusiasm, how his cheeks were flushed red with cold and excitement. "Hey!" he called out when he saw me watching. "Want to help? This guy's going to be taller than the school." I didn't hesitate. For the next hour, we worked side by side, laughing and joking as we built our icy masterpiece. By the time the bell rang, calling us back inside, we were both soaked to the bone and grinning from ear to ear. That was the start of a friendship that would shape the rest of my life. As we grew up, Jesse and I were inseparable. We spent countless hours exploring the woods behind his house, building rickety tree houses, and sharing our deepest secrets. Jesse had this way about him, a kind of magnetic energy that made you feel like anything was possible when you were around him. He was always coming up with wild ideas and crazy adventures, and I was more than happy to go along for the ride. I remember one summer when we were about 14, Jesse got it into his head that we should build a raft and float down the river that ran through town. We spent weeks scavenging for wood and rope, hammering and tying until we had something that vaguely resembled a floating platform. The day we finally launched it, we felt like proper explorers setting off to discover new lands. Of course, reality quickly set in when our makeshift vessel started taking on water about 10 minutes into our journey. We ended up having to abandon ship and swim to shore, dragging our waterlogged raft behind us. But even as we stood there, dripping and defeated, Jesse just threw his head back and laughed. "Well," he said, "I guess we learned something about boat building today." That was Jesse all over, always able to find the silver lining, always ready with a joke or a smile to lighten the mood. It was no surprise to me when he met Mara in college and fell head over heels. She was his perfect match, just as adventurous and full of life as he was. I was best man at their wedding, and I don't think I've ever seen two people more in love. When their daughter Lise was born a few years later, it felt like Jesse's life was complete. He doted on that little girl, something fierce. I remember visiting them when Lise was about 2, and Jesse spent the entire afternoon chasing her around the backyard, both of them giggling like mad as he pretended to be a tickle monster. That's why what happened next was so devastating. It was a cold, clear day in January when I got the call. Jesse's voice on the other end of the line was hollow, barely recognizable. "They're gone," he said. "Mara and Lise. There was an accident." I rushed over to his place immediately. The details came out in bits and pieces over the next few hours. Mara had taken Lise to visit her parents for the weekend. On the drive back, they hit a patch of black ice. The car spun out of control and went off the road. They were pronounced dead at the scene. I've never seen someone so utterly broken as Jesse was in those first few weeks after the accident. It was like all the light had gone out of him. He barely ate, barely slept. I practically moved in, just trying to keep him functioning. But there's only so much you can do in the face of that kind of grief. Months passed, and while Jesse started going through the motions of living again, it was clear he was just a shell of his former self. That spark, that energy that had always defined him, was gone. I tried everything I could think of to help him, suggested therapy, support groups, even medication, but nothing seemed to make a dent. Then, out of the blue, Jesse called me up one day with an odd request. "I need you to come on a trip with me," he said. "It's important." I agreed without hesitation, of course. Anything that might help Jesse was worth trying. But as he started explaining the details, I found myself growing increasingly concerned. He wanted us to hike up to some remote mountain cave in the dead of winter. Apparently, he'd heard about this place from a guy in one of his grief support groups. A cave behind a frozen waterfall where people supposedly went to commune with lost loved ones. It sounded crazy to me, and more than a little dangerous. But the way Jesse talked about it, there was a hint of that old enthusiasm in his voice. For the first time since the accident, he seemed to have a purpose. How could I say no to that? So that's how I found myself, a week later, trudging through knee-deep snow in the middle of nowhere. Jesse led the way, consulting a hand-drawn map every so often. The cold was brutal, seeping through my layers of winter gear and chilling me to the bone. But Jesse seemed oblivious to the discomfort, pushing forward with single-minded determination. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and orange, we finally heard the distant roar of water. Rounding a bend, we saw it, a massive wall of ice, glittering in the fading light. The frozen waterfall was even more impressive than I'd imagined, easily 100 feet tall and twice as wide. "There," Jesse said, pointing to a dark opening at the base of the ice. That's the entrance to the cave. We set up camp just inside the cave mouth, the sound of the water rushing behind the ice creating an eerie, constant background noise. Jesse explained that we needed to stay here for 3 days and nights, fasting and meditating. It all sounded like New Age nonsense to me, but I kept my doubts to myself. If there was even a chance this could help Jesse find some peace, it was worth it. The next 3 days were some of the strangest of my life. We sat for hours in silence, the cold seeping into our bones, despite the thermal sleeping bags and layers of clothing. Jesse spent most of the time with his eyes closed, occasionally muttering under his breath. I tried to meditate too, but mostly I just worried about Jesse and wondered how long it would take to get help if something went wrong out here. On the 3rd day, something changed. Jesse's eyes snapped open, and he let out a gasp that echoed through the cave. "I can see them," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Mira and Lise. They're here." I looked around frantically, but saw nothing except the ice-covered walls of the cave. "Jesse," I started to say, but he cut me off with a gesture. "I know you can't see them," he said softly, "but they're here. Mira's wearing that green sweater she loved, and Lise, God, she's gotten so big. They're smiling at me." Tears were streaming down Jesse's face now, but for the first time in months, he was smiling too. I sat there in stunned silence as he carried on a one-sided conversation, telling Mira and Lise how much he missed them, how sorry he was that he couldn't protect them. After what felt like hours, Jesse finally turned to me, his eyes shining with a mix of tears and something I can only describe as peace. "They're gone now," he said, "but they're okay, and I think maybe I will be too." I'd like to say that everything changed overnight after that, but of course, it didn't work that way. Grief isn't something you can just shake off, even with a spiritual experience like Jesse had. But that trip to the cave did mark a turning point. Slowly but surely, Jesse started to come back to life. He began to talk about Mira and Lise again, sharing happy memories instead of just dwelling on their loss. He went back to work, started reconnecting with friends. There were still bad days, of course, times when the grief would hit him like a tidal wave. But he was learning to ride those waves instead of being pulled under by them. One thing that became a tradition was our annual winter trip. Every year on the anniversary of that first cave visit, Jesse and I would pack up our gear and head out into the wilderness. We never went back to that specific cave. Jesse said he didn't need to, but we'd find some quiet, beautiful spot to set up camp and spend a few days remembering Mira and Lise. It's been years now since that first trip, and I still don't know what to make of what happened in that cave. Was it a genuine spiritual experience? A hallucination brought on by grief, cold, and fasting? Or just Jesse's mind finally finding a way to process his loss? I suppose it doesn't really matter. What matters is that it helped my friend find a way to keep living, to carry the memory of his family with him without being crushed by their absence. As for me, well, I've learned a lot from Jesse over the years, about resilience, about the power of belief, and about the strange, unpredictable ways that healing can happen. But most of all, I've learned about the incredible strength of the human spirit, because if Jesse could find a way to keep going, to find joy again after everything he lost, then maybe there's hope for all of us to weather whatever storms life throws our way. So here's to you, Jesse Calloway, my oldest friend and the bravest person I know. And here's to Mira and Lise, wherever they may be. Your story will never be forgotten. I never thought a simple haircut appointment would turn my life upside down. but that's exactly what happened last winter. I'm a hairstylist at a small salon in the city, and I was working late one evening when the snow started coming down hard. By the time my last client left, it was a full-on blizzard outside. As I was locking up the salon, a guy named Adrian pulled up on his motorcycle. He was a regular client of mine, always chatty and flirtatious during his appointments. That night, he offered me a ride home since the weather was so bad. I hesitated. Getting on a motorcycle in a snowstorm seemed risky, but the alternative was walking several miles in the freezing cold, so I reluctantly accepted. Adrian handed me a spare helmet, and I climbed on behind him, wrapping my arms tightly around his waist. As we took off down the empty streets, I immediately regretted my decision. The bike was sliding all over the place on the icy roads. Adrian was driving way too fast, taking sharp turns that made my stomach lurch. I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed we'd make it to my apartment in one piece. Suddenly, Adrian made an abrupt turn down an unfamiliar side street. "Where are we going?" I shouted over the roar of the engine. He didn't respond. My heart started racing as we headed further away from my neighborhood into an industrial area I didn't recognize. Just as I was about to demand that Adrian stop the bike, he pulled into the parking lot of an abandoned warehouse. Before I could say anything, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with long dark hair, bundled up in a heavy coat. "Who's this?" she asked, glaring at me as I climbed off the bike on shaky legs. "No one important," Adrian replied dismissively. "Just giving her a ride home." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You're lying," she hissed. "I've seen her before. She's the one who cuts your hair, isn't she? The one you're always talking about." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the frigid air. Who was this woman? And why had Adrian brought me here to meet her? "Calm down, Vanessa," Adrian said, his tone placating. "Don't make a scene." "Don't tell me to calm down," Vanessa shrieked. She lunged forward and grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin through my coat sleeve. "Stay away from him, you little slut." I yanked my arm away, stumbling backwards. "I don't know what's going on here, but I want no part of it," I said, my voice shaking. "Adrian, take me home right now, or I'm calling the police." Adrian sighed heavily. "Fine, let's go. Vanessa, we'll talk later." As we sped away, I heard Vanessa screaming threats and obscenities behind us. I was trembling uncontrollably, my mind reeling. What kind of psycho had I just encountered? And why the hell had Adrian put me in that situation? When we finally reached my apartment, I practically leapt off the bike before it had fully stopped. "Don't ever contact me again," I told Adrian fiercely. "And don't come back to the salon. I mean it." He started to protest, but I was already running inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. I spent a sleepless night jumping at every little sound, convinced Vanessa was going to show up at any moment. The next day at work, I was a nervous wreck. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see Vanessa's angry face in the mirror behind me. When my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, my blood ran cold. "I know where you work. I'll be seeing you soon." I deleted the message with shaking hands. It had to be Vanessa. How had she gotten my number? Over the next week, the threatening texts continued. Sometimes it was just a single word, "soon." Other times it was more graphic, detailing all the ways she was going to make me suffer. I changed my number, but somehow she kept finding ways to contact me. One night, as I was closing up the salon, I glimpsed a familiar figure across the street, a woman with long dark hair, watching me. I blinked and she was gone, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Vanessa was stalking me. I started varying my routes to and from work, constantly looking over my shoulder. I asked my boss if I could change my schedule, work different hours. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The final straw came when I woke up one morning to find all 4 tires on my car slashed. Scrawled on the hood in red paint were the words, "He's mine." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I quit my job that day and booked a one-way ticket to stay with my sister in another state. I left most of my belongings behind, too terrified to spend any more time packing than absolutely necessary. As my plane took off, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was finally escaping Vanessa's reign of terror. But even now, months later, I still find myself looking over my shoulder, startling at shadows. I can't shake the feeling that she's out there somewhere, waiting. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I've heard her voice whispering soon in my ear. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. All because I accepted a motorcycle ride from the wrong person on a snowy night. It just goes to show how quickly your whole life can change in an instant. I've tried to move on, to put that terrifying chapter of my life behind me. But late at night, when the house is quiet and still, I find myself wondering, did I really escape? Or is Vanessa still out there, biding her time, waiting for the right moment to make good on her threats? The rational part of my brain knows I'm probably safe now. Vanessa couldn't possibly have followed me across the country. But then I remember the intensity in her eyes that night, the pure hatred and jealousy radiating off her. And I wonder if there's any distance far enough to truly escape someone that unhinged. I've considered going to the police, but what would I even tell them? That months ago, in another state, my hairdresser's crazy ex-girlfriend threatened me, that I'm still paranoid she might be after me. They'd probably just tell me to relax, that I'm letting my imagination run wild. But I know what I experienced was real. The terror I felt was real. The threats were real. Sometimes I pull out my old phone and scroll through the saved screenshots of Vanessa's messages, just to remind myself I didn't imagine the whole thing. I try to take precautions. I'm hyper-vigilant about my surroundings. I vary my routines. I'm extremely careful about what I post on social media. But is it enough? Will I ever truly feel safe again? I've thought about reaching out to Adrian, trying to get more information about Vanessa. But then I remember how cavalierly he put me in danger that night, how dismissive he was of Vanessa's unstable behavior. He's part of the problem, not the solution. Sometimes I wonder what became of them after I left town. Did Vanessa's obsession transfer fully to Adrian once I was gone? Or did she continue fixating on me, furious that I'd slipped through her fingers? The not knowing is almost worse than anything else. I'm trying to rebuild my life here. I've got a new job. I'm making friends. But there's always a part of me that feels like I'm living on borrowed time. Like at any moment, Vanessa could materialize and shatter this fragile sense of security I've managed to construct. I know it probably sounds paranoid. Maybe I am letting my imagination run away with me. But until you've been on the receiving end of that kind of focused, unhinged hatred, you can't understand how it burrows into your psyche, how it colors every interaction and taints every moment of peace. So I go through my days with a tense watchfulness, always braced for the other shoe to drop, always wondering if today will be the day Vanessa makes good on her promise, always listening for that whispered soon that haunts my nightmares. I don't know if I'll ever fully heal from the trauma of that experience. All I can do is take it one day at a time and hope that eventually the fear will fade. That one day I'll be able to hear a motorcycle engine without my heart racing. or see a woman with long dark hair without breaking into a cold sweat. Until then, I'll keep looking over my shoulder, keep varying my routines, keep my guard up. Because the alternative, letting my guard down and potentially coming face to face with Vanessa again, is too terrifying to contemplate. So if you're reading this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you've ever been stalked or threatened or made to feel unsafe in your own skin, know that you're not alone. Know that your feelings are valid. And most importantly, know that it's okay to prioritize your safety and peace of mind above all else. Because at the end of the day, that's all we really have. And once it's taken away, you realize just how precious it truly is. So be careful out there and trust your instincts. You never know when a simple act, like accepting a ride on a snowy night, might change your life forever. We had driven several hours into the remote wilderness, far from any towns or cell phone service. The air was crisp and cold as we hiked to our secluded campsite, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. We spent the afternoon setting up our tents, gathering firewood, and getting everything organized. As night fell, we huddled around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. It was peaceful and serene, the star-filled sky above us and the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees. When we finally turned in for the night, I felt content and relaxed. Max and I were sharing one tent, while Nate and Layla took the other. I drifted off to sleep easily, lulled by the quiet sounds of the forest. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up, but it was still pitch black outside. At first I wasn't sure what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it. A strange rustling noise coming from outside the tent. It didn't sound like an animal. It was more purposeful, almost like footsteps crunching through the snow. My heart started racing as I lay completely still, straining my ears. The noise seemed to be circling our campsite. I wanted to wake Max, but I was paralyzed with fear. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded away. I managed to convince myself it was probably just a deer or some other harmless wildlife. Eventually, I fell back into an uneasy sleep. The next thing I knew, it was morning. Pale sunlight was filtering through the tent walls. As I started to stir, I realized something felt off. The air in the tent felt different somehow, colder. I sat up and looked over at Max. He was awake too, staring at the tent ceiling with a troubled expression. "Did you hear anything weird last night?" I asked hesitantly. Max turned to me, his face pale. "I had the strangest dream," he said quietly. "There was this thing standing outside our tent. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it watching me. It felt so real. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the noises I'd heard. Before I could respond, we heard Layla's voice from outside. "Guys, you need to come see this." There was an edge of panic in her tone that made us scramble out of the tent immediately. As soon as I unzipped the flap, I froze in shock. Our campsite was completely destroyed. The other tent was in shreds, pieces of fabric and metal poles scattered across the snow. Our backpacks and gear had been flung in every direction. Food wrappers and clothes were strewn about haphazardly. It looked like a tornado had torn through our little clearing. "What the hell happened?" Nate exclaimed, looking around wildly. I stumbled out of the tent, my mind reeling as I tried to process the scene before me. "Is everyone okay? Was it a bear?" Layla shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "We didn't hear anything. We just woke up and found this." As we stood there in stunned silence, Max suddenly gasped. "Guys, where's the car?" My blood ran cold as I realized he was right. We had parked our SUV just on the edge of the clearing last night. Now it was nowhere to be seen. "This isn't possible," I muttered, my breath coming in short gasps. How could someone move our car without us hearing anything? We fanned out, searching desperately for any sign of our vehicle or clues about what had happened. The snow around the campsite was oddly undisturbed. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing to indicate how our belongings had been so thoroughly decimated. After about 20 minutes of frantic searching, Nate called out from the far side of the clearing. "I found it!" We rushed over to where he was standing, staring in disbelief. Our SUV was there, partially hidden behind a thick cluster of trees. But it wasn't where we had left it. It was at least 100 yards away from its original parking spot, in an area we would have had to navigate through dense forest to reach. How is this possible?" Layla whispered, her voice shaking. I circled the vehicle, examining it closely. There wasn't a scratch on it. The doors were still locked. It was as if it had been picked up and placed here by some impossible force. As the initial shock began to wear off, a deep sense of dread settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever had done this was still out there somewhere. "We need to get out of here," I said firmly. "Now." No one argued. We hastily gathered what we could salvage of our gear and piled into the car. As I turned the key in the ignition, I half expected it not to start, but the engine roared to life, and I gunned it out of there as fast as I dared on the snowy mountain roads. The drive back to civilization was tense and quiet. We were all lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we had experienced. I kept checking the rearview mirror, unable to shake the paranoid feeling that something was following us. When we finally got back to town and had cell service again, we debated whether to report the incident to the police. But what would we even say? We had no evidence, no explanation for what had happened. In the end, we decided to try to put it behind us and never speak of it again. But I haven't been able to forget. I still have nightmares about that night, about unseen presences circling our campsite. I've never gone camping again, and I don't think I ever will. The others feel the same way. We've drifted apart since then, too traumatized by our shared experience to maintain our friendships. Sometimes I try to rationalize it. Maybe we were drugged somehow and hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe it was an elaborate prank, though I can't imagine how anyone could have pulled it off so flawlessly. But deep down, I know the truth. Something inexplicable happened to us that night in the mountains. Something that defies all logical explanation. I'm sharing this story now in the hopes that someone out there might have experienced something similar, that maybe someone can help me make sense of it all. Because until I understand what really happened that night, I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe again. I'm Emily, an experienced hiker and camper who's always loved pushing my limits in the great outdoors. I'd done plenty of solo trips before, but never in such an isolated area during the harsh winter months. Looking back, I realize how naive and overconfident I was, but at the time, I was excited for the challenge and solitude. After driving several hours into the backcountry, I parked my car at a deserted trailhead and shouldered my heavy pack. The temperature was well below freezing as I set off down the snow-covered trail, my boots crunching with each step. By late afternoon, I'd hiked about 8 miles to my planned campsite, a small clearing nestled between towering pines. As I set up my four-season tent and got a small fire going, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. The forest was silent except for the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of snow. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. I heated up some dehydrated soup for dinner and settled in for a cozy night of reading by lantern light before bed. That first night passed uneventfully. I woke at dawn feeling refreshed and ready to explore. After a quick breakfast, I set out on a day hike, leaving most of my gear at the campsite. The scenery was breathtaking, pristine snow blanketing the landscape, icicles glittering on tree branches. I hiked for hours, reveling in the solitude and beauty. But as I made my way back to camp that afternoon, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. When I finally reached my campsite, everything looked undisturbed. I tried to shake off my paranoia, chalking it up to spending too much time alone. But as I went to grab some trail mix from my pack, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, pinned under a rock on top of my backpack, was a small scrap of paper. With trembling hands, I unfolded it and read the message scrawled in messy handwriting. "I see you, Emily. Do you see me?" My heart began to race. How did they know my name? I spun in a circle, searching frantically for any sign of another person. But the woods were silent and still. Trying to stay calm, I told myself it must be some kind of sick prank. Maybe another hiker had passed through while I was gone and decided to mess with me. But deep down, I knew that made no sense. I was miles from any trail, in an area that saw almost no visitors this time of year. As darkness fell, my fear grew. Every snapping twig or rustle of wind made me jump. I didn't want to leave the safety of my tent, but I also didn't want to be trapped if someone was out there. I barely slept that night, clutching my hunting knife and straining to hear any sounds of an intruder. The next morning, I woke to find another note, this time slipped under the door of my tent. My hands shook as I read it. "You look so peaceful when you sleep. Sweet dreams, Emily." Panic flooded through me. Someone had been right outside my tent while I slept, close enough to see me through the thin fabric. I felt violated and terrified. I knew I should pack up and get out of there immediately. But a fierce snowstorm had blown in overnight. Visibility was near zero, and the temperature had plummeted. Attempting to hike out in these conditions would be suicidal. I was trapped. All day I huddled in my tent, jumping at every sound. I tried to convince myself that I could handle this, that I was tough and capable. But as the hours dragged on, I felt my sanity starting to fray. Who was doing this? What did they want? That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat up with my knife in hand, watching the walls of the tent for any shadows. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside, circling me. But when I called out, there was only silence. Just before dawn, I heard something land on top of my tent with a soft thud. My heart pounding, I slowly unzipped the door and peeked out. A small package wrapped in brown paper sat in the snow. I snatched it inside quickly. With shaking hands, I unwrapped it to find a small hand-carved wooden figure. It was a crude carving of a person, a woman. It was me, down to the details of the clothes I was wearing. Wrapped around its neck was a tiny noose made of thread. I broke down then, sobbing uncontrollably. This sick game had gone too far. As soon as there was enough light, I threw my essential gear in my pack and broke camp in record time. I no longer cared about the cold or the snow. I had to get out of there. As I rushed down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified I'd see someone pursuing me. The snow was falling heavily, quickly covering my tracks. After a few hours of exhausting hiking, I finally glimpsed my car through the trees. I nearly cried with relief. But as I broke through the tree line into the parking area, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a hooded figure leaning against my car. I stood frozen as they slowly turned to face me. I couldn't make out any features in the shadows of the hood. Heart pounding, I managed to choke out, "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure took a step towards me and spoke in a low, raspy voice. "Oh, Emily, don't you recognize me? I'm hurt. After all, I've known you for so long. I was there on your first camping trip with your parents when you were 8. I watched you learn to start a fire and pitch a tent. I've seen how you've grown into such a skilled outdoors woman." I felt the blood drain from my face. How could they possibly know those things? They continued, "I've always been here, Emily, watching, waiting. You were never truly alone out here, and you never will be." I wanted to run, to scream, to fight, but I was paralyzed with fear. The figure reached towards me with a gloved hand. Just as they were about to touch me, a car came around the bend into the parking lot. The figure quickly slipped into the woods and vanished. I broke out of my trance and sprinted to my car, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock it. I drove away as fast as I dared on the icy roads, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. It's been months since that horrifying trip, but I still have nightmares about that hooded figure. I've gone over every detail 1,000 times, trying to make sense of it. But I'm left with so many unanswered questions. Who were they? How did they know so much about me? Were they really watching me all those years? I haven't been camping since. I'm not sure I ever will again. The wilderness that I once loved now fills me with dread, because I know that somewhere out there, someone is watching, waiting, and I'll never truly be alone in the woods again. I never thought I'd be so terrified of a place I once considered peaceful. It all started when my friend asked me to house-sit her cabin for a week while she was on vacation. I jumped at the opportunity, thinking it would be a nice break from city life. The cabin was nestled in a beautiful forest, far from any neighbors or civilization. I packed my bags, grabbed my 2 dogs, Toby and Luna, and set off for what I thought would be a relaxing getaway. The first day was perfect. I arrived in the afternoon, settled in, and took the dogs for a long walk in the woods. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. As the sun began to set, we headed back to the cabin. That's when I first saw him. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, just watching the cabin. A tall, lanky figure wearing what looked like old, tattered clothes. I couldn't make out his face clearly from that distance, but something about his stance made me uneasy. I quickly ushered the dogs inside and locked the door behind us. I tried to shake off the creepy feeling, telling myself it was probably just a hiker passing through. But as I was making dinner, I glanced out the window and saw him again. Same spot, same stance, just watching. My heart started racing. I double-checked all the locks and drew the curtains. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the old cabin made me jump. Toby and Luna seemed restless too, pacing and whining occasionally. When morning finally came, I cautiously peeked out the window. The man was gone, and I breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe I had just been paranoid. I decided to call my friend and ask if she knew anything about a strange man in the area. Her response chilled me to the bone. "Oh, that's probably just Ray," she said casually. "He's harmless. Don't worry about him. He's been wandering those woods for years." Harmless? How could she be so nonchalant about a stranger lurking around her property? I wanted to press for more information, but she had to go, leaving me with more questions than answers. Despite my unease, I tried to enjoy the day. I took the dogs for another walk, this time sticking closer to the cabin. We played fetch in the yard, and I started to relax a bit. But as the afternoon wore on, That feeling of being watched crept back. I scanned the tree line, and there he was again, Ray, standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the cabin. This time I could see his face more clearly. His skin was weathered and pale, his eyes sunken and dark. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me in any way. He just stared. I quickly retreated inside with the dogs, my heart pounding. This didn't feel harmless. This felt like stalking, like a predator watching its prey. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes I'd peek out the window. Sometimes Ray would be gone, but he always came back, always in the same spot. As night fell, my anxiety skyrocketed. I made sure all the curtains were drawn and turned on every light in the cabin. Toby and Luna sensed my fear and stayed close, which was somewhat comforting. I tried to watch TV, but the sound of the wind in the trees kept making me think I heard footsteps outside. Around midnight, Toby started growling at the front door. Luna joined in, her hackles raised. I froze, straining my ears to hear what had alerted them. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone slowly walking up the porch steps. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, but remembered there was no cell service out here. The landline. I rushed to the kitchen where the old corded phone was mounted on the wall. With shaking hands, I picked up the receiver, only to be met with silence. The line was dead. The footsteps on the porch stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, broken by the low growls of my dogs. Then, a soft knock at the door. My blood ran cold. "Hello?" a raspy voice called out. "I know you're in there. Why don't you come out and talk?" It was Ray. His voice sounded wrong, like he wasn't used to speaking. I remained silent, praying he would go away. "Don't be afraid," he continued, his tone eerily calm. "I just want to talk. I've been so lonely out here." I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Why was he doing this? What did he want? The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Please," Ray pleaded. "I've been watching you. You seem nice. I just want a friend." His words sent shivers down my spine. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and huddled in the corner with Toby and Luna, trying to make myself as small as possible. The knocking continued, growing louder and more frantic. "Let me in." Ray's voice had changed, becoming angry and desperate. "I know you're alone in there. I've been watching you for days." Days? I'd only been here since yesterday. What was he talking about? The pounding on the door grew so violent I was sure it would break at any moment. Toby and Luna were barking furiously now, adding to the chaos. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The pounding stopped. The dogs fell silent. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then I heard a new sound, the creak of a window being slowly pushed open in the back bedroom. My heart nearly stopped. I had checked all the windows, hadn't I? With the knife clutched tightly in my hand, I crept towards the bedroom, Toby and Luna close at my heels. The door was ajar, and I could hear someone moving inside. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open, ready to confront Ray. But the room was empty. The window was closed and locked, just as I had left it. I checked every corner, under the bed, in the closet. Nothing. Confused and terrified, I did a sweep of the entire cabin. Every door and window was secure. There was no sign that anyone had been inside. Had I imagined it all? I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch with Toby and Luna, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my things and the dogs, leaving a note for my friend explaining that I had to leave early due to an emergency. As I was loading up the car, I took one last look at the tree line. There was Ray, watching me, but this time he smiled and waved. as if we were old friends parting ways. I practically threw the dogs in the car and sped away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe Ray really was harmless, and my imagination got the best of me. Maybe it was all just a vivid nightmare brought on by being alone in an unfamiliar place. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real. I've never told my friend the full story of what happened. How could I explain the terror I felt? The certainty that something evil was trying to get to me? She still owns the cabin, still goes there for vacations. Sometimes I wonder if Ray is still there, watching and waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor. One thing's for certain, I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some places are better left alone, and some strangers are better left as strangers. The memory of Ray's final wave and smile still haunts me, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things are those we can't fully explain. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Nate, and our friends Mia and Jake. We'd been planning this trip for months, excited to experience the beauty of the frozen wilderness. We chose a remote campsite near a lake, miles away from civilization. Looking back, I wish we'd picked somewhere closer to town. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The sun was already starting to set, casting long shadows through the bare trees. As we set up our tents, I remember feeling a sense of unease. The forest was so quiet, no birds chirping, no small animals scurrying about, just an oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of snow under our boots. Mia and Jake were in high spirits, though, laughing as they playfully threw snowballs at each other. Their excitement was infectious, and soon we were all in better moods as we got a fire going and settled in for the evening. As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. We huddled around the fire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. Jake suggested we go check out the frozen lake in the morning. "I bet the ice is thick enough to walk on," he said with a grin. "We could try some ice fishing." I remember Nate looking uncertain. "I don't know, man, that sounds pretty dangerous. What if the ice isn't as solid as it looks?" But Jake waved off his concerns. "Don't be such a worrywart. It'll be fine. Right, Mia?" Mia nodded eagerly. "Yeah, it'll be an adventure. Come on, guys. Where's your sense of fun?" I should have spoken up then. Should have insisted we stick to safer activities. But I didn't want to be the party pooper, so I just shrugged and went along with it. We turned in for the night, the fire dying down to embers. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind whistling through the trees. Something about this place just felt wrong. But I told myself I was being silly and eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up to Mia's excited voice outside my tent. "Rise and shine, sleepyheads. Time to explore." Groggily, I crawled out of my sleeping bag and got dressed. It was even colder than the day before, my breath coming out in white puffs. Nate emerged from his tent looking just as bleary-eyed as I felt. Jake and Mia were already dressed in their winter gear, practically bouncing with anticipation. "Come on, slow pokes," Jake called. "The lake awaits." We grabbed some snacks and water bottles, then set off through the trees. The hike to the lake took about 20 minutes. When we emerged from the forest, I gasped. The lake stretched out before us, a vast expanse of pristine white. The morning sun glinted off the ice, making it sparkle like diamonds. For a moment, my uneasiness faded. It really was breathtakingly beautiful. But then I noticed how unnaturally still everything was. No wind, no animal sounds, just that oppressive silence again. Jake whooped and started carefully making his way onto the ice. Mia followed close behind him. Nate and I hung back, exchanging worried glances. "Guys, "Maybe we should stick closer to the shore," I called out. "We don't know how thick the ice is out there." But they either didn't hear me or chose to ignore my warning. They were about 50 feet out now, laughing as they slid around. "See, it's totally fine," Jake yelled back. "Come on, don't be chickens." Reluctantly, Nate and I stepped onto the ice. We moved slowly, testing each step. The ice seemed solid enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. We'd made it about halfway to where Mia and Jake were when it happened. A low, rumbling sound filled the air. At first I thought the ice was cracking, but this was different. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Mia screamed. I looked up to see her pointing at something on the far side of the lake. A dark figure was gliding across the ice with unnatural speed. It moved in a jerky, inhuman way that made my skin crawl. "What the hell is that?" Nate whispered, his voice shaking. The figure was getting closer. As it neared, I could make out more details. It looked like a person, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. It wore tattered, ragged clothing that billowed around it like smoke. Jake and Mia started scrambling back towards us, terror evident on their faces. But the ice seemed to have other plans. With a sickening crack, a fissure opened up between us. "Run!" I screamed. "Get back to shore!" Nate and I turned and bolted for the tree line. The rumbling sound was getting louder, drowning out everything else. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The figure was almost upon Mia and Jake now. I saw Jake stumble and fall. Mia reached for him, but then, I still can't explain what I saw next. It was like the ice opened up and swallowed them both. 1 second they were there, and the next they were just gone. The figure paused where they had disappeared. It turned its head towards us, and I swear I felt its gaze lock onto me. I've never felt such pure, primal terror in my life. Somehow Nate and I made it back to solid ground. We collapsed in the snow, gasping for breath. The rumbling had stopped. When I looked back at the lake, the figure was gone. The ice was smooth and unbroken, as if nothing had happened. "Where are they?" Nate choked out. "What the fuck just happened?" I couldn't answer. My mind couldn't process what I'd just witnessed. We stayed there for what felt like hours, calling out for Mia and Jake until our voices were hoarse, but there was no sign of them. Finally, we stumbled back to our campsite and called for help on the satellite phone we'd brought for emergencies. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Search and rescue teams arrived, combing the area and drilling holes in the ice. But they found nothing. No bodies, no sign of our friends. The official report ruled it as an accidental drowning. They said Mia and Jake must have fallen through thin ice and been swept under by currents. But Nate and I know the truth. We saw something out there on that lake, something that shouldn't exist. It's been 2 years since that day, and I still have nightmares about it. I see that figure gliding across the ice, its ragged form silhouetted against the white expanse. I hear that terrible rumbling sound and wake up in a cold sweat. Nate and I have tried to move on with our lives, but it's hard. We've never spoken publicly about what really happened. Who would believe us? But we know what we saw. Something took our friends that day. Something that lurks in those quiet, frozen woods, waiting for unsuspecting victims. I don't go camping anymore. I can't stand the silence of the wilderness or the stark whiteness of snow. And lakes, I avoid them at all costs. Because every time I see a frozen lake, I remember that day. I remember the cracking ice, the inhuman figure, and the terrified faces of my friends before they vanished forever. So if you're planning a winter camping trip, take my advice. Stay away from frozen lakes. Stick to marked trails and populated areas, because you never know what might be hiding out there in the silent, snowy woods. And once it sets its sights on you, there's no escape. I often wonder if Mia and Jake are still out there somewhere, trapped beneath the ice or in some otherworldly realm. Part of me hopes they're at peace, but another part of me fears they're still conscious, still aware, enduring some unimaginable horror. And I can't help but feel guilty that we couldn't save them. Sometimes, on quiet winter nights, I think I hear Mia's laugh on the wind or catch a glimpse of Jake's face in the shadows. It's probably just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me. But there's always that seed of doubt, that lingering question, what if? I know I'll never have answers. I'll never fully understand what happened that day on the frozen lake. All I can do is try to warn others, to prevent anyone else from suffering the same fate as my friends. So please, heed my warning. Be careful out there in the wilderness, and if you ever hear a strange rumbling sound or see an unnatural figure gliding across the ice, run, and don't look back, because some things are better left undisturbed. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and sometimes the price of curiosity is far too high. We arrived at the lake late in the afternoon. The sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the frozen landscape. The lake itself was a vast expanse of white, completely frozen over. As we set up our tent on the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling of how isolated we were. The nearest town was miles away, and there wasn't another soul in sight. Jake was in his element, excitedly talking about ice fishing and winter survival techniques. I nodded along, trying to muster some enthusiasm, but the biting cold was already seeping through my layers. As night fell, we huddled around our small campfire, sipping hot cocoa and munching on energy bars. That's when we first heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the direction of the lake. At first, I thought it was just the ice shifting, but there was an odd rhythm to it. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. You hear that? I asked Jake, my breath visible in the frigid air. He nodded, his brow furrowed. Probably just the ice settling. Lakes make all sorts of weird noises in the winter. I wanted to believe him, but something about that sound set my teeth on edge. We tried to ignore it, focusing on our conversation, but the tapping continued intermittently throughout the night. By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, I was exhausted, but on edge. I woke up in the middle of the night, my bladder urgently full. Cursing silently, I unzipped my sleeping bag and fumbled for my boots and jacket. The temperature had dropped even further, and my breath came out in thick plumes as I stepped outside the tent. The full moon cast an eerie glow over the lake, turning everything into shades of blue and silver. As I walked towards the tree line to relieve myself, movement on the lake caught my eye. I froze, squinting into the darkness. There, about 50 yards out on the ice, was a dark shape. It was hard to make out details, but it seemed to be hunched over, moving in small, jerky motions. My heart began to race. Was it an animal? A person? How could anything be out there in this cold? Suddenly, the shape straightened up. It was tall, impossibly tall, and then it turned, and I swear I saw 2 pinpricks of light where its eyes should be, reflecting the moonlight like a cat's. I stumbled backward, my feet tangling in the snow. By the time I regained my balance and looked again, the shape was gone. The lake was empty, pristine white snow stretching as far as I could see. I hurried back to the tent, my need to pee forgotten. I crawled into my sleeping bag, heart pounding, and lay there for what felt like hours, straining to hear any sound from outside. But there was nothing except the occasional creak of branches heavy with snow. When morning finally came, I was groggy and disoriented. Jake was already up, stoking the fire and brewing coffee. I debated whether to tell him about what I'd seen, but in the bright morning light, it seemed absurd. I must have been half asleep, my mind playing tricks on me. After breakfast, Jake suggested we explore the lake. I was reluctant, but he insisted it would be fun to check out the ice fishing spots. As we walked onto the frozen surface, the ice creaked and groaned beneath our feet. Jake assured me it was thick enough to hold us, but every step made me nervous. We'd been walking for about 10 minutes when Jake suddenly stopped. "Hey, check this out," he called, pointing at something on the ice. I approached cautiously, my eyes widening as I saw what had caught his attention. There was a perfect circle cut into the ice, about 3 feet in diameter. The edges were smooth, as if cut by a machine, but that was impossible out here. And around the edge of the hole were scratches, deep gouges in the ice that looked disturbingly like claw marks. "What the hell?" I muttered, crouching down to get a closer look. The hole was filled with water, dark and still. I couldn't see the bottom. Jake was just as puzzled. "Maybe it's an old ice fishing hole," he suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. As we stood there, debating what could have caused this, I heard it again, the tapping, tap, tap, tap. But this time it wasn't faint. It was coming from directly beneath us, from under the ice. We both jumped back, staring at each other in shock. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. And then, to my horror, I saw something moving in the water-filled hole. At first it was just a dark shape, indistinct and blurry. But as it rose closer to the surface, I could make out what looked like fingers, long, pale fingers with sharp, black nails. They gripped the edge of the hole, and I watched in paralyzed terror as a hand emerged from the water. It wasn't a human hand. The fingers were too long, the skin a sickly grayish white. As it gripped the ice, I could hear a scraping sound. Those nails were leaving more of those claw-like gouges we'd seen. "Run!" Jake's shout snapped me out of my trance. We turned and bolted towards the shore, the ice creaking ominously under our pounding feet. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see emerging from that hole. We reached the shore, gasping for breath, and finally turned to look at the lake. The hole was still there, a dark blemish on the white expanse, but there was no sign of whatever that thing had been. "What the fuck was that?" Jake panted, his face pale. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. We spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert, jumping at every sound. The tapping continued intermittently, sometimes seeming to come from one part of the lake, sometimes another. As night fell, we debated whether to pack up and leave, but the thought of driving those icy roads in the dark seemed even more dangerous than staying put. We built up the fire as big as we dared, neither of us willing to admit how scared we were. Sleep was out of the question. We sat huddled by the fire, watching the lake and listening. Around midnight, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. And then we heard it, a sound like ice cracking, followed by a splash. Slowly, reluctantly, we turned our flashlights towards the lake. At first, we saw nothing. But then, about 100 yards out, something broke the surface of the ice. It was hard to make out details in the darkness, but what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was vaguely humanoid, but much too tall and thin. Its arms were impossibly long, ending in those ghastly hands we'd seen earlier. but it was the face that made my blood run cold. It was featureless except for two enormous glowing eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like a cat's. For a moment, it just stood there, water streaming off its body, and then it began to move towards us, sliding across the ice with unnatural speed. We didn't even think, we just ran. We abandoned our tent, our gear, everything. We sprinted to Jake's truck, our lungs burning in the frigid air. I fumbled with the door handle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. As Jake gunned the engine, I looked back one last time. The creature had reached the shore and was now standing at the edge of our campsite, those glowing eyes fixed on us, and I swear I could feel its hunger, its alien intelligence. We tore out of there, the truck fishtailing on the icy road. We didn't stop, didn't even slow down, until we reached the main highway nearly an hour later. We never spoke about what happened that night. How could we? Who would believe us? We made up a story about getting spooked by some animal noises to explain our hasty departure and abandonment of our gear. But sometimes, on cold winter nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, imagining I hear that faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. And I wonder what's lurking beneath the ice of that remote lake, waiting for its next victim. My husband Tom was away on a business trip, so it was just me and our cat Milo holding down the fort. I didn't mind being alone usually. I actually enjoyed the peace and quiet. But something about the ferocity of this storm had me on edge. The house creaked and groaned as gusts of wind battered against it. Tree branches scratched against the siding like bony fingers. I tried to focus on my book, but found myself glancing up nervously every few minutes. Around 9 p.m. I heard it, a sharp, distinct knock at the front door, 3 raps in quick succession. I froze, my heart instantly racing. Who on earth would be out in this weather, and how had they even made it up our long, unplowed driveway? "Hello?" I called out tentatively. No response. I crept towards the entryway, debating whether or not to open the door. Before I could decide, another series of knocks rang out, this time at the back door in the kitchen. I whirled around, my breath catching in my throat. How was that possible? There was no way someone could have circled the house that quickly in waist-deep snow. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what this meant. There had to be more than one person out there. My mind raced with possibilities, each more frightening than the last. Burglars taking advantage of the storm, escaped convicts seeking shelter. I shakily pulled out my phone to call the police, but of course there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. I backed away from both doors, retreating to the living room. My hands trembled as I tried to think of what to do. Should I make a run for it? Try to get to a neighbor's house? But in this blizzard, I'd likely freeze to death before making it far. Just then my phone buzzed with an incoming text. My heart leapt. Maybe the cell service was back. But when I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. It was from an unknown number and contained just 4 chilling words. "Please let me in." I stared at the message in horror, my mind reeling. How did they know I was here alone? How did they get this number? Before I could process it, another volley of knocks erupted, this time from the sliding glass door in the dining room. I jumped, dropping my phone with a clatter. The knocking was more insistent now, an urgent pounding that seemed to rattle the whole house. Panicked, I ran upstairs to the bedroom and locked myself in, pushing a heavy dresser in front of the door for good measure. I was full-on hyperventilating now, terror coursing through my veins. The pounding continued downstairs, moving from door to door in a frenzied circuit. Front door, back door, side door, over and over again. It was maddening. I cowered in the corner of the room, hands pressed over my ears, trying to block out the sound. But it only grew louder, more frantic. Now it wasn't just the doors. Windows were being struck too, the glass vibrating from the force of it. The entire house seemed to shake. Hours passed like this, though it felt like an eternity. The relentless pounding, pounding, pounding. Sometimes it would stop for a few blessed minutes of silence, only to start up again with renewed intensity. I was certain the doors and windows would splinter at any moment. My phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "We're waiting. Let us in." I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but my voice was frozen in my throat. I curled into a tight ball, squeezing my eyes shut and praying for it to end. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The abrupt silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound at all. Nothing, just the faint whistle of wind outside. I don't know how long I stayed like that, too terrified to move. Eventually, pale morning light began to filter through the curtains. The storm had passed. With shaking legs, I finally worked up the courage to emerge from the bedroom. I crept downstairs, every nerve on high alert, but the house was empty and still. I checked every door and window, all intact, no sign of damage or forced entry. Outside, pristine snow blanketed everything. There wasn't a single footprint to be seen. When the police finally arrived, they were baffled. They searched the property thoroughly, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No evidence of intruders, no tracks in the snow. They suggested it may have been debris blown by the wind or tree branches scraping against the house. The texts were dismissed as a wrong number or prank. But I know what I experienced. The intensity, the coordination of it all, it wasn't natural. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there that night. Something that wanted in. Something that's still waiting, watching. I've never felt safe in my own home again. I don't know if it was something supernatural, or maybe just some sick, elaborate hoax, but whatever it was, it changed me. I jump at every creak and groan of the house now. I triple-check the locks before bed, and I never, ever stay home alone during a snowstorm. Sometimes on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear it. That insistent, rhythmic knocking. A reminder that whatever was out there that night might come back. And next time, it might not take no for an answer. I was never one to believe in the supernatural. Growing up, I scoffed at ghost stories and rolled my eyes at tales of hauntings. But after what happened to me last winter, I'm not so sure anymore. I still struggle to make sense of it all. It was the middle of January, and a massive blizzard had descended on the city. I lived alone in a small third-floor apartment at the time. As the storm raged outside, I settled in for what I thought would be a cozy night indoors. The wind howled fiercely, rattling the windows. Snow pelted against the glass in dizzying swirls of white. I made some hot cocoa and curled up on the couch with a book, feeling snug and secure as the storm raged. Around 9 p.m., the lights suddenly flickered and went out. Great, I thought with a sigh. Just what I needed. A power outage in the middle of a blizzard. I fumbled around in the dark for my phone to use as a flashlight. The battery was low, only about 20% left. I'd have to conserve it. Using the dim light from my phone, I made my way to the kitchen to find some candles. As I rummaged through drawers, a loud thump from somewhere in the apartment made me freeze. I stood stock still, listening intently. For several long moments, there was only silence. Then I heard it again, a dull thud, like something heavy falling. It seemed to be coming from the vicinity of my bedroom. My heart began to race. Was someone in my apartment? Had a window blown open in the storm? I called out hesitantly, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response, just the howling of the wind outside. I tried to calm myself. It was probably just the storm causing things to shift and settle in the building. Nothing to worry about. Still, I decided to go check it out, if only to put my mind at ease. Clutching my phone, I crept down the hallway towards my bedroom. The floorboards creaked under my feet, seeming impossibly loud in the darkness. As I neared the bedroom, I heard another sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across my bedroom floor. I could hear the distinct sound of weight shifting on the old wooden planks. My breath caught in my throat. There was someone in there. Panic flooded through me. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. My mind raced. Should I confront the intruder? Try to escape the apartment? Call for help? Before I could decide, the footsteps started moving towards the bedroom door. My body reacted on instinct. I bolted for the front door, fumbling with trembling hands to undo the locks. Just as I got the door open, the power suddenly came back on. Lights blazed to life throughout the apartment. I blinked in the sudden brightness, momentarily stunned. Silence fell. No more footsteps. No sign of an intruder. Feeling foolish, I closed the front door and relocked it. Had I imagined the whole thing? Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me in the darkness. I cautiously made my way back to the bedroom, flicking on lights as I went. The room was empty, everything in its place. No open windows, no sign anyone had been there. I checked every closet and corner of the apartment. Nothing. Embarrassed by my panicked reaction, I tried to settle back in for the night. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Those footsteps had sounded so real. I left the TV on for background noise and distraction. As the hours ticked by, I started to relax. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside all was calm. Around midnight, I decided to try and get some sleep. I had just started to drift off when a tremendous bang jolted me awake. It sounded like something had slammed into the front door of my apartment. I sat bolt upright, every nerve on high alert. What the hell was that? Had a neighbor fallen against my door? Then it came again. Bang! 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 3 thunderous blows that shook the entire door in its frame. This was no accident. Someone or something was trying to break in. Terror gripped me. I leapt out of bed and pressed myself against the wall, as far from the bedroom door as possible. The banging continued, growing more frenzied. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. As it rang, I heard a new sound that chilled me to my core. Scraping, scratching noises, like claws or knives dragging down the outside of my bedroom door. When the operator answered, I frantically tried to explain the situation, my voice a panicked whisper. She assured me police were on the way and told me to stay on the line. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. The banging and scratching continued relentlessly. I cowered in the corner, certain that at any moment my door would splinter and whatever was out there would come for me. Just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the blessed sound of sirens approaching. As soon as they got close, the noises abruptly stopped. Silence fell, broken only by my ragged breathing and the operator's voice asking if I was okay. A few minutes later, there was a knock at my front door, and a male voice identified himself as police. I crept out of the bedroom on trembling legs and let them in. 2 officers did a thorough search of my apartment and the hallway outside. They found no signs of an intruder or forced entry. The front door was unmarked and still securely locked. I must have seemed hysterical as I tried to convince them of what I'd heard. They were professional, but I could tell they were skeptical. One of them gently suggested that perhaps the storm had caused debris to blow against the building, creating strange noises. I was about to grudgingly accept their explanation when I remembered the scratching sounds on my bedroom door. I asked them to take a look. When we entered the bedroom, my blood ran cold. There, on the outside of the door, were deep gouges in the wood. 4 parallel lines, looking for all the world like claw marks, ran from nearly the top of the door all the way to the floor. The officer's demeanor changed immediately. They photographed the marks and took my statement again, this time with grave attention to every detail. They agreed to station a car outside my building for the rest of the night and strongly suggested I stay elsewhere until they could complete a more thorough investigation. I didn't need to be told twice. I packed a bag with shaking hands, and my brother came to pick me up. I never spent another night in that apartment. In the following days, the police did a comprehensive search of the building and surrounding area. They found no evidence of an intruder or any explanation for what had happened. The claw marks on my door defied explanation. They were far too deep and long to have been made by a person or any known animal. I broke my lease and moved as soon as I could. To this day, I have no logical explanation for the events of that night. Was it some kind of elaborate prank? A wild animal that somehow got into the building? Or something else? All I know is that I no longer scoff at ghost stories or tales of the paranormal. There are things in this world that defy rational explanation, and sometimes the monsters that go bump in the night are all too real. I was never a fan of winter, but this year's brutal cold snap made me despise it even more. The constant snowfall had trapped me inside the old rental house I shared with my roommate, Lisa. She had left town for the holidays, leaving me to weather the storm alone. Little did I know that solitude would soon become the least of my worries. It was late afternoon when the power went out. One moment I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone. The next, I was plunged into darkness. The sudden silence was eerie. No hum of electronics, no furnace kicking on, just the howling wind outside. I fumbled around for candles and matches, cursing under my breath. This storm was wreaking havoc on the power lines, and who knew how long it would be out. As night fell, the temperature in the house started to drop. I bundled up in layers and huddled under blankets, but I could still see my breath in the flickering candlelight. The old house creaked and groaned as gusts of wind battered against it. I tried to distract myself by reading, but found myself constantly glancing up at every little noise. Around midnight, I heard a loud thump from upstairs. My heart leapt into my throat. It sounded like it had come from Lisa's room. Probably just something falling over in the wind, I tried to reassure myself. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, and then what sounded like footsteps. My mind raced. Had someone broken in? But how? All the doors and windows were locked tight against the storm. Maybe an animal had gotten in somehow. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and crept towards the stairs, straining my ears. The footsteps had stopped, but now I heard a faint scratching sound. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, fear keeping me rooted in place. Part of me wanted to just barricade myself in my room and wait it out, but I knew I had to investigate. Taking a deep breath, I slowly climbed the stairs, wincing at every creak of the old wood. The upstairs hallway was pitch black. I swept my phone light back and forth, half expecting to see someone, or something, lunging at me from the shadows, but it was empty. The The scratching sound was coming from Lisa's closed bedroom door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. I counted to 3 in my head, then flung the door open, holding my phone out like a weapon. The beam of light illuminated nothing. The room was exactly as Lisa had left it. I did a quick sweep, checking under the bed and in the closet. No sign of any intruder. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were wet footprints on the hardwood floor, leading from the window to the door. They were small, like a child's, but oddly shaped, almost animal-like, and they glistened with a strange, oily sheen in the light of my phone. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. This wasn't possible. We were on the 2nd floor. There was no way someone could have climbed in through the window. And those footprints, they weren't human. My mind reeled, trying to come up with a rational explanation. I practically ran down the stairs, eager to put as much distance between myself and whatever had made those prints. But as I reached the bottom, a blast of frigid air hit me. To my horror, I saw that the front door was wide open, snow blowing in and coating the entryway. I rushed to close it, my heart pounding. Had I forgotten to lock it earlier? No, I distinctly remembered checking it multiple times. Someone, or something, must have opened it from the inside. The realization made me feel sick. As I turned back towards the living room, my light caught more of those strange, wet footprints crossing the floor. They led from the stairs straight to the open door. But that's not what filled me with paralyzing terror. It was the fact that there were only prints going one way. Whatever had come down the stairs hadn't left. It had come back inside. I wanted to run, to get out of that house and never look back. But the blizzard raged outside, and I knew I'd freeze to death in minutes if I tried to leave. I was trapped. With shaking hands, I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a fireplace poker, and began searching the house room by room. Every shadow made me jump. Every creak of the old floors sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. But I found nothing. After what felt like hours, I'd checked every nook and cranny of the 1st floor. Whatever had made those footprints seemed to be gone. I slumped against the wall, exhausted and terrified. Maybe I was imagining things. The isolation and the storm were playing tricks on my mind. Just as I started to relax, I heard it. A soft thud from directly above me, then another. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the upstairs hallway. I gripped the poker so tight my knuckles turned white, eyes fixed on the top of the stairs. The steps grew closer, and I saw a shadow move across the wall. My breath caught in my throat as a figure began to descend. In the dim light, I could make out a small, hunched shape. It moved with an unnatural, jerky gait. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything. But I was frozen in place, unable to even blink as the thing reached the bottom of the stairs. It turned towards me, and in that moment, I felt true, primal terror. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else entirely. Its skin was pale and glossy, almost translucent. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless surface. But somehow, I knew it was looking right at me. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, facing each other in the darkness. Then, without warning, it lunged. I swung the poker wildly, feeling it connect with something solid. There was an inhuman shriek, and suddenly I was knocked to the ground. I scrambled backwards, swinging the poker blindly, but my attacker was gone. I heard the front door slam open, and by the time I got to my feet, all I saw were those bizarre footprints in the snow, leading off into the woods. I slammed the door shut and barricaded it with every piece of furniture I could move. Then I ran upstairs and did the same to my bedroom door. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, poker clutched to my chest, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed. I emerged from my room, half expecting to find the house in shambles, but everything was exactly as it had been. The only evidence of the night's terror were those footprints, now melted into faint, damp spots on the floor. I called the police, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. They chalked it up to my imagination and the stress of being alone during the storm. Even Lisa, when she returned, couldn't find anything amiss in her room. Sometimes I think maybe they were right. Maybe it was all in my head, but then I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear the faintest scratch at my window late at night. And I know, deep in my bones, that whatever visited me that night is still out there, waiting, watching, and someday it will return. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend at my cabin in the mountains. I'd been looking forward to some quiet time alone, away from the bustle of the city. The weather forecast had mentioned a chance of snow, but I wasn't too worried. I'd stocked up on supplies and was prepared to hunker down if needed. The snow started falling lightly on Friday evening. By Saturday morning, it was coming down hard. I woke up to a world of white outside my windows, the trees sagging under the weight of the snow. It was beautiful, in a stark sort of way. I made myself a cup of coffee and settled in by the fireplace with a book, enjoying the peaceful silence. As the day wore on, the storm intensified. The wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the cabin. Snow piled up against the windows, and I could barely see the driveway anymore. I started to feel a bit uneasy, realizing just how isolated I was out here. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and in this weather, that might as well have been on another planet. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was being silly. I'd been alone in the cabin plenty of times before, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the ferocity of the storm, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. Either way, I couldn't quite relax. As night fell, the storm showed no signs of letting up. I made dinner and tried to distract myself with TV, but the reception was spotty due to the weather. Just as I was considering turning in early, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. "Shit," I muttered, fumbling around in the sudden darkness. I found my phone and used its flashlight to navigate to the kitchen, where I kept some candles and matches. As I lit a few candles around the living room, I tried to convince myself that this was no big deal. The power would probably be back on by morning. That's when I heard it. A soft thump from somewhere outside. I froze, straining my ears. It could have been snow falling from a tree branch, I told myself. But then I heard it again, closer this time, and again. It sounded like footsteps. My heart started racing. Who could possibly be out there in this weather? I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The snow was still coming down hard, making it difficult to see anything beyond the porch. But then a shadow moved across the yard, barely visible in the faint light from my candles. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. I was imagining things. I had to be. But then came a sound that made my blood run cold. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, hoping that if I stayed quiet, whoever or whatever was out there would go away. But then I heard a voice, muffled by the door and the howling wind, but unmistakable. "Hey, my name. I know you're in there. Let me in." How did they know my name? I'd never told anyone I was coming up here this weekend. I didn't even know many people in this area. My hands shaking, I reached for my phone to call 911, only to realize with horror that I had no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. "Come on, my name. It's freezing out here," the voice called again, louder this time. There was something off about it, something that sent chills down my spine. It sounded almost eager, like it was barely containing its excitement. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What should I do? I couldn't just let them in, but I couldn't stay here either. They clearly knew I was inside. As if reading my thoughts, the voice called out again, "If you don't let me in, I'll find another way. You know I will." That's when I remembered the attic. It was small and dusty, accessible only through a trap door in the ceiling of the spare bedroom. I'd never had a reason to go up there before, but now it seemed like my only option. I grabbed my phone and a candle, then made my way as quietly as possible to the spare room. Just as I reached for the cord to pull down the attic stairs, I heard a loud crash from the living room. They'd broken in. Panic surged through me as I yanked down the stairs and scrambled up into the attic, pulling the trap door closed behind me. I barely dared to breathe as I heard heavy footsteps moving through the cabin below. "Oh, my name," the voice sang out, sounding gleeful now. "Where are you hiding? Don't you want to play?" I cowered in the corner of the attic, surrounded by old boxes and cobwebs. The candle cast flickering shadows on the walls, and every creak of the floorboards below made me flinch. I could hear them moving from room to room, opening doors, searching. Come out, wherever you are," they called, their voice growing angrier with each passing moment. I heard the sound of something shattering, probably one of the vases in the living room. They were trashing the place in their fury. Hours seemed to pass, though it was probably only minutes. The intruders' rage grew with each empty room they found. They started yelling incoherently, punctuated by the sounds of more things breaking. I sat there, frozen in terror, praying they wouldn't think to look in the attic. Suddenly, everything went quiet. Had they left? I strained my ears, trying to hear any movement below. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the front door open and close. I waited, hardly daring to hope it was over. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, unable to stand the suspense any longer, I slowly, carefully opened the trap door and peeked out. The cabin was a mess. Furniture overturned, pictures ripped from the walls, shards of broken glass everywhere. But it was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. I made my way downstairs on shaky legs, grabbing a kitchen knife just in case. The front door was hanging off its hinges, letting in a blast of cold air and snow. I approached cautiously, peering out into the night. The storm had finally begun to let up, and in the faint pre-dawn light, I could see fresh footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin. They headed straight for the woods at the edge of the property, then simply stopped, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I slammed the door shut as best I could and wedged a chair under the handle. Then I collapsed on the couch, shaking uncontrollably. What had just happened? Who was that person? And how did they know my name? And where did they go? As the sun rose, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, I sat there, unable to move, unable to process what I'd been through. The power came back on around noon, but I barely noticed. I kept replaying the night's events in my head, trying to make sense of it all. It's been weeks now, and I still don't have any answers. The police found no evidence of the intruder beyond the footprints in the snow. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. They suggested it might have been a local troublemaker who'd seen my car at the cabin and decided to play a sick prank. But I know it was more than that. The way they said my name, the glee in their voice as they searched for me. It wasn't just some random person. They knew me. They wanted me. I haven't been back to the cabin since that night. I'm not sure I ever will. Sometimes, when the wind howls outside my city apartment, I think I hear that voice again, calling my name, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for another chance to finish whatever game they started that snowy night. I was alone in my cozy farmhouse on the outskirts of town, curled up on the couch with a good book and a cup of hot cocoa as a blizzard raged outside. The wind howled fiercely, rattling the windows and sending icy drafts creeping in despite my best efforts to insulate. I pulled my fuzzy blanket tighter around me, trying to ward off the chill. Suddenly, the lights flickered ominously before going out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Great, just what I needed. A power outage in the middle of a snowstorm. I fumbled around for my phone to use as a flashlight, cursing under my breath. As I made my way to the kitchen to find some candles, a loud thump from the front porch made me freeze in my tracks. My heart began to race as I heard another thump, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. Who could possibly be out in this weather? We were miles from the nearest neighbor. I crept cautiously towards the window, straining to see through the frost-covered glass. A dark figure loomed on the other side, barely visible through the swirling snow. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out the shape of a man standing there, completely still. He was dressed only in jeans and a t-shirt, no coat or winter gear at all. How was that possible in this blizzard? A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about this situation felt very, very wrong. I ducked down below the window, praying he hadn't seen me. Maybe if I stayed quiet, he would go away. Bang, bang, bang! I nearly jumped out of my skin as loud pounding echoed through the house. "Hello? Is anyone home? Please, I need help," a man's voice called out. Every instinct screamed at me not to answer. This whole scenario was like something out of a horror movie. Who shows up at a remote house in the middle of the night during a blizzard, dressed for summer? It had to be some kind of trap or ruse. I stayed frozen in place, barely daring to breathe. After a minute of silence, I heard footsteps crunching away from the front door. I let out a shaky sigh of relief. He must have given up and left. Bang, bang, bang. This time the pounding came from the back door, making me yelp in surprise. How had he gotten around the house so quickly in this weather? "Please, I know someone's in there. I saw a light earlier. I'm freezing out here. I just need to come in for a minute to warm up." My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I call the police? But in this storm, it would take them ages to get here, and I had no way to know if this guy was actually dangerous or just someone who genuinely needed help. As I debated, the pounding suddenly stopped. An eerie silence fell over the house. I strained my ears, trying to hear any sign of movement outside. Nothing. Minutes ticked by. I began to relax slightly, thinking maybe he had finally given up and left for real this time. I allowed myself to breathe normally again. Crash! The sound of shattering glass from upstairs had me scrambling to my feet in terror. Oh God, he had broken in. I raced towards my bedroom, fumbling with shaking hands to lock the door behind me. I dove for my cell phone, ready to call 911, only to find there was no signal. Of course not. Not in this storm. Heavy footsteps creaked on the floorboards above, slow and methodical. He was searching the rooms. It was only a matter of time before he made his way down here. I had to find a way out or a place to hide, fast. The window was no good. Even if I could force it open through the ice, I'd never make it far in the blizzard outside. Under the bed? No, too obvious. My eyes landed on the small door leading to the attic, and I knew it was my only chance. I eased the door open as quietly as possible, wincing at every tiny creak. The footsteps were getting closer. With my heart in my throat, I hauled myself up into the dusty, cramped space and pulled the door shut behind me just as I heard my bedroom door handle start to rattle. I lay there in the pitch darkness, trying desperately to control my panicked breathing as I listened to the intruder force his way into my room below. Tears streamed silently down my face as I heard him methodically searching, opening drawers and closets. "Please don't look up here. Please don't look up here," I silently begged. I don't know how long I stayed frozen in that attic, scarcely daring to move a muscle. It felt like hours. Eventually, the sounds of searching moved away to other parts of the house. I knew I couldn't stay up there forever. Sooner or later he would think to check the attic. I had to find a way out of this nightmare. Straining my ears, I tried to pinpoint where in the house the intruder was now. The creaking floorboards seemed to be coming from downstairs again. This might be my only chance. Moving as silently as I could manage, I eased the attic door open and peeked out. The bedroom appeared empty. I slipped down, my legs shaky beneath me. The power was still out, leaving the house in almost total darkness. I couldn't risk using my phone light for fear of giving away my position. Inching forward, I made my way towards the stairs, pausing every few seconds to listen. I could hear movement from the kitchen below, the clinking of dishes, cabinets opening and closing. What on earth was he doing down there? I pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter. I just had to focus on getting out alive. The stairs loomed before me, a gauntlet I'd have to run to reach the front door. Taking a deep breath, I started down as quickly and quietly as I could manage. I was halfway there when a floorboard let out a loud creak beneath my foot. The sounds from the kitchen abruptly stopped. I froze, not even daring to breathe. After a moment of agonizing silence, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps heading my way. Panic surged through me. There was no time for stealth now. I bolted down the remaining stairs and sprinted for the front door, fumbling with the locks. I could hear him right behind me as I finally wrenched the door open and plunged out into the howling blizzard. The freezing wind and snow hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran blindly into the storm, not knowing or caring where I was going as long as it was away from the house. My lungs burned as I gasped in the frigid air. I didn't know how long I could keep going in these conditions without proper gear. After what felt like miles, my foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow and I went sprawling. I lay there for a moment, dazed and winded. As I pushed myself up, I realized I could make out lights in the distance. Civilization. Somehow in my panic, I must have run in the direction of town without realizing it. Hope gave me a fresh surge of energy, and I stumbled onward towards those distant lights. As I drew closer, I recognized the squat cinder-block building of the 24-hour gas station on the edge of town. I burst through the doors, startling the sleepy-looking clerk behind the counter. "Please, you have to help me," I gasped out between chattering teeth. "There's someone in my house. He broke in. I think he was trying to kill me." The clerk's eyes went wide, and he quickly ushered me behind the counter, locking the door and calling the police. As we waited for them to arrive, he wrapped me in a blanket and pressed a styrofoam cup of coffee into my shaking hands. When the police finally made it through the storm, I told them everything that had happened. They seemed skeptical at first, clearly thinking I was some hysterical woman, overreacting to a simple break-in. But something in my voice, or the wild terror in my eyes, must have convinced them to take me seriously. A couple of officers drove me back out to my house to investigate. The blizzard had died down by then, leaving everything blanketed in pristine white snow. As we pulled up, I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the cold. The house looked completely undisturbed, no broken windows, no sign of forced entry anywhere. Inside was much the same. Nothing appeared to be missing or out of place. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I would have sworn no one had been in the house at all. The police were clearly dubious now, exchanged glances that said they thought I must have imagined the whole thing. But then one of them called us over to the back door. There in the snow were a set of footprints, barefoot footprints, leading away from the house and into the woods beyond. The officers' demeanor changed instantly, hands going to their weapons as they began a thorough search of the property and surrounding area. They never found any sign of the intruder. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that night. Who was that man? And how did he survive the blizzard in nothing but a t-shirt and jeans? Why did he break into my house, only to apparently take nothing? And those bare footprints in the snow, how was that even possible? I ended up selling the house and moving into an apartment in town. I couldn't bear to spend another night alone out there, jumping at every creak and shadow. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, imagining I hear footsteps creeping up the stairs. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again after that night. All I know is that something terrifying and inexplicable happened to me, and I thank my lucky stars every day that I made it out alive. It started out as a typical snowy evening in late January. The forecasts had been warning about a major storm system moving in, so I'd stocked up on supplies and settled in for a cozy night indoors. By around 8 p.m., the wind was really starting to howl and snow was coming down in thick blankets. I could barely see the streetlights outside my living room window through the swirling white. I was curled up on the couch with a book, half listening to the TV news in the background, when the power suddenly cut out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, and an eerie silence fell. No more hum of the heater or refrigerator, just the muffled roar of wind outside. At first I wasn't too concerned. Power outages weren't uncommon during big storms. I fumbled around for my phone to use as a flashlight and went to grab some candles from the kitchen. As I was lighting them, I heard an odd scratching sound coming from somewhere in the apartment. It was faint but distinct, like fingernails dragging slowly across a surface. I froze, straining my ears. The sound stopped after a few seconds. Must have just been the wind rattling something, I told myself. But a prickle of unease ran down my spine. I tried to go back to reading by candlelight, but found myself too on edge to focus. Every creak of the building settling made me jump. The scratching noise came again, louder this time, seeming to emanate from the wall behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, but saw nothing out of place. That's when the knocking started. 3 sharp raps on my front door that echoed through the silent apartment. I nearly leapt out of my skin. Who the hell would be out in this storm, coming to my door at this hour? "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. No response, just another set of 3 knocks, more insistent this time. I crept towards the door, debating whether or not to open it. Before I could decide, the knocking abruptly stopped. I pressed my ear to the door, but heard nothing. After a long, tense moment, I convinced myself it must have been a neighbor checking to see if I had power. Sighing with relief, I turned away, only to hear heavy footsteps in the hallway outside. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause right in front of my door. The floorboards creaked ominously under the weight. I held my breath, not daring to move a muscle. The footsteps started up again, moving further down the hall before fading away. A door slammed in the distance. My hands were shaking as I triple-checked that my own door was securely locked. What the hell was going on? I tried to rationalize that it was just other residents moving around in the darkness, but something felt very, very wrong. I retreated to my bedroom, bringing all the candles with me. I didn't want to be alone in the dark living room anymore. As I huddled on my bed, I could have sworn I heard more scratching noises, this time coming from inside the walls. It would start and stop at irregular intervals, sometimes lasting several minutes. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. Heavy, measured steps coming down the hallway towards my apartment. My breath caught in my throat as they slowed to a stop right outside my door. Then came the knocking again, louder, more aggressive. It quickly turned to pounding, like someone was trying to break the door down. I let out a strangled yelp of terror and scrambled for my phone to call 911. As I fumbled with shaking fingers to dial, I heard a blood-curdling shriek from the hallway. It didn't sound human. The pounding intensified to a frenzied assault on my door. I could hear the wood starting to splinter. "Please, help me," I sobbed into the phone when the operator answered. "Someone's trying to break into my apartment." The next few minutes were a blur of terror as I cowered in the furthest corner of my bedroom, listening to the violent attempts to get through my front door. The inhuman shrieks continued, along with a sound like claws raking down the wood. Just as I was certain the door was about to give way, everything went silent. The sudden stillness was almost as unnerving as the chaos had been. I stayed frozen in place, barely breathing, straining my ears for any sound. After what felt like an eternity, I heard sirens in the distance. A wave of relief washed over me. Help was coming. When the police finally arrived, they did a thorough search of the building, but found no signs of an intruder. The storm had dumped over 2 feet of snow. There were no footprints outside besides their own. I was still trembling uncontrollably as I tried to explain what had happened. The officers were skeptical, clearly thinking I had imagined things in the darkness and storm. But then one of them shone his flashlight on my front door. Long, deep claw marks were gouged into the wood, far too big to have been made by a person or any normal animal. The officer's face went pale. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered. They took some photos and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but I could tell they were as unsettled and confused as I was. As soon as they left, I packed a bag and got the hell out of there, going to stay with a friend across town. I broke my lease and moved out permanently as soon as I could find a new place. I just couldn't bear to spend another night in that apartment. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that night. I still have nightmares about those sounds, the scratching, the footsteps, that inhuman shriek. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear knocking at my door. I don't live alone anymore. I don't think I'll ever feel safe being on my own again, especially during storms. Whatever was trying to get to me that night, I'm terrified it's still out there somewhere, and I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, it's going to find me again. I hurried inside, grateful for the warmth and shelter. As I shed my coat and boots, I noticed how eerily quiet it was, without the usual hum of electricity. The storm must have knocked out the power. No matter, I thought. I'd light some candles and curl up with a good book until it came back on. I had just settled onto the couch with a blanket when I heard it, a loud, sharp knock at the front door. My heart leapt into my throat. Who could possibly be out in this weather? "Hello?" I called out tentatively. "Who's there?" There was no response, just another series of urgent knocks. Uneasiness crept over me as I slowly approached the door. Through the peephole, I could make out a male figure, hunched against the wind and snow. "Can I help you?" I asked through the door, not daring to open it. "Please," a man's voice pleaded. "I need help. My car broke down up the road. I'm freezing out here." I hesitated, torn between compassion and caution. Something felt off about the situation. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you in," I replied. "I can call for help if you'd like." "No signal," the man said quickly. "Please, I'm desperate. I won't hurt you, I swear. I just need to warm up for a few minutes." As he spoke, I noticed dark stains on his coat. With a jolt of horror, I realized it was blood. "Sir, you're hurt," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Let me call an ambulance for you." "No!" he shouted, suddenly enraged. He began pounding on the door. "Let me in now!" Terrified, I backed away from the door. "Go away, or I'm calling the police," I yelled, praying my voice didn't betray my fear. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard footsteps crunching through the snow, moving around to the side of the house. My blood ran cold as I realized he was looking for another way in. I ran from room to room, checking that all the windows and doors were securely locked. As I passed the kitchen, I heard a rattling sound. To my horror, I saw a hand reaching through the dog door, fumbling for the lock. I grabbed the heaviest pan I could find and brought it down hard on the intruder's fingers. He let out a howl of pain and withdrew his hand. "Get out of here!" I screamed. "I've called the police. They're on their way." It was a lie. My cell phone had no service due to the storm, but I prayed he would believe it and leave. For several agonizing minutes, I heard nothing. Had he given up? Just as I started to relax, there was a tremendous crash from upstairs. He must have broken a window and climbed in. Panic overwhelmed me. I was trapped. Running outside into the blizzard would be suicide, but staying here with a dangerous intruder was unthinkable. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and hid in the coat closet, my entire body shaking. I could hear his heavy footsteps moving from room to room, searching for me. Tears streamed down my face as I silently begged for help, for this nightmare to end. The footsteps drew closer. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The closet door began to open. Suddenly, red and blue lights flooded through the windows, accompanied by the blessed sound of sirens. Someone must have seen the broken window and called for help. "Police, come out with your hands up!" a voice boomed through a megaphone. I burst out of the closet, sobbing with relief. "He's upstairs!" I cried. "Please help me!" The next few minutes were a blur. Officers swarmed the house, quickly apprehending the intruder. As they led him out in handcuffs, I caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were wild, unfocused. Blood matted his hair and clothing. I later learned he had escaped from a nearby psychiatric facility earlier that day. He had attacked a nurse during his escape, which explained the blood. In his delusional state, he had fixated on my isolated cabin as a safe haven. It's been months since that horrifying night, but I still have nightmares about those thunderous knocks, those blood-stained hands reaching for me in the darkness. I've since moved to an apartment in the city, surrounded by neighbors and bright lights. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that danger is just outside my door, waiting to break in. I was so excited for our winter getaway to Silver Peak. My best friend Leah and I had been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the daily grind and enjoy some snow-covered mountain views. As we set off early that morning in Leah's old Subaru, the roads were practically empty and a light snow was falling. We cranked up the heat and sang along to our favorite playlist, feeling carefree and adventurous. About 2 hours into the drive, we spotted a lone figure walking along the side of the desolate mountain road, thumb stuck out. It was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair peeking out from under a red knit hat. She had on a puffy black coat and was carrying a small backpack. "Should we stop?" Leah asked, already slowing down. I hesitated. We didn't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about this girl made me feel sorry for her. It was freezing out, and we hadn't passed any towns in ages. "Yeah, let's see if she needs help," I agreed. Leah pulled over and rolled down the window. "Hey there, need a ride?" The girl's face lit up with relief. "Oh my gosh, yes please. I've been walking for hours. I'm Anna." We introduced ourselves, and Anna climbed into the back seat, bringing a blast of frigid air with her. She rubbed her hands together, teeth chattering. "Thank you so much. I thought I was going to freeze to death out there." "No problem at all," Leah said cheerfully. "Where are you headed?" "Silver Peak, actually," Anna replied. "My car broke down about 20 miles back, and I've been trying to get there to meet some friends." What a coincidence that she was going to the same small mountain town as us. I twisted around in my seat to get a better look at her. She was quite pretty, with delicate features and striking green eyes. But there was something a bit off about her demeanor. Her smile seemed forced, and she kept glancing around nervously. "Well, you're in luck. That's where we're going too," I said. "We can drop you right in town." Anna's eyes widened. "Oh, wow, that's so nice of you. I really appreciate it." As we continued driving, Leah and I chatted easily about our plans for the weekend, hiking, checking out the quaint shops in town, maybe doing some skiing if conditions were good. Anna was quiet in the back seat, just observing. When I'd glance back at her, she'd quickly look away. After about an hour, we pulled into a rest stop to use the bathroom and stretch our legs. As Anna got out of the car, I noticed she was clinging tightly to her small backpack. "You can leave that in the car if you want," I offered. "We'll only be a few minutes." "Oh, that's okay," Anna stammered. "I like to keep it with me." Inside the rest stop building, Leah and I headed for the restrooms, while Anna said she was going to grab a snack from the vending machines. When I came out of the stall, I was surprised to see Anna at the sinks, rifling frantically through her backpack. She didn't notice me at first. What caught my eye was a large knife that had fallen out onto the counter. It wasn't just a pocket knife, but a serious hunting blade at least 8 inches long. Anna cursed under her breath and quickly shoved it back in the bag. My heart started pounding. Why on earth would she be carrying something like that? Anna finally looked up and saw me staring. Her eyes went wide with panic for a split second before she composed herself. "Oh, hey," she said with forced casualness. "Just, looking for some chapstick. It's so dry up here in the mountains, you know." I nodded weakly, unsure how to respond. Anna zipped up her bag and practically ran out of the bathroom. When Leah and I got back to the car, Anna was already in the back seat staring out the window. I pulled Leah aside before we got in. "Hey, did you notice anything weird about Anna?" I whispered. Leah shrugged. "Not really. Why?" I quickly told her about the knife. Leah's eyes went wide. "Holy shit," she muttered. "What should we do?" I bit my lip, conflicted. "I don't know. Maybe it's nothing? She seems harmless enough. And we can't just leave her out here in the middle of nowhere." Leah nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess you're right. Let's just keep an eye on her. We're almost to Silver Peak anyway." We got back in the car, both of us now hyper-aware of our mysterious passenger. I tried to engage Anna in conversation, hoping to get a better read on her. "So Anna, what brings you to Silver Peak? Visiting friends?" "Oh, yeah," she replied vaguely. "Just a little weekend trip." "Cool. We love it up here," I said. "Have you been before?" Anna's eyes darted around. "No, first time," she mumbled. I pressed on. "Where are you from originally?" Oh, you know, around, Anna said evasively. I move a lot. It was clear she didn't want to give away any personal details. The rest of the drive passed in tense silence. Finally, we arrived in Silver Peak, just as the sun was setting. The quaint main street was decorated for the holidays, strings of white lights twinkling in the dusk. Where can we drop you, Anna? Leah asked as we entered town. Oh, anywhere is fine, Anna said. Maybe by that coffee shop up there. We pulled over in front of Silver Peak Coffee Co. Anna gathered her things and got out. Thanks again for the ride, she said. Really appreciate it. No problem, I replied, forcing a smile. Take care. As Anna walked away, Leah and I exchanged a look of relief. Well, that was weird, Leah said. Glad that's over. Where's our motel again? We found the Silver Pine Inn just down the street and checked into our cozy room. After the long drive and strange encounter with Anna, we were both exhausted. We grabbed a quick dinner at the diner next door and turned in early. I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. As I was washing my hands, I glanced out the small window and froze. There in the parking lot, illuminated by a streetlight, was a familiar figure in a puffy black coat. Anna was just standing there, staring up at our second-floor room. My blood ran cold. How did she know where we were staying? I quickly shook Leah awake. Leah, Anna's outside. Leah bolted upright. What? Are you sure? We both peered out the window, but the parking lot was empty now. I swear she was just there, I insisted, standing right under that light. We double-checked that the door was locked and tried to go back to sleep, but I lay awake for hours, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, there was no sign of Anna. We tried to shake off our unease and enjoy our day in Silver Peak, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. When we returned to our room that evening, there was a folded note that had been slipped under the door. With shaking hands, I opened it. You should have been more careful. A. Leah and I stared at each other in horror. Without a word, we threw our stuff in our bags and raced out to the car. We drove straight home through the night, only stopping for gas. To this day, I have no idea who Anna really was or what she wanted. But I'll never forget those piercing green eyes, or the chill that ran down my spine when I saw her in the motel parking lot. Needless to say, Leah and I are a lot more cautious about picking up hitchhikers now. I was so excited to surprise my sister for her birthday. We've always been close, and I try to visit her every year on her special day. This time, I decided to make the drive despite the blizzard warnings. I've driven in snow plenty of times before. How bad could it be? As I set out early that morning, fat snowflakes were already starting to fall. The roads were clear, though, and I cranked up some tunes, feeling optimistic about the 6-hour drive ahead. About 2 hours in, the snow really started coming down. The windshield wipers were working overtime, and visibility was getting worse by the minute. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, leaning forward to peer through the whiteout conditions. Before long, I couldn't even see the lines on the road anymore. Everything was just a blanket of white. My GPS kept recalculating as I crawled along at 15 mph, desperately trying to stay on the road. The few other cars I'd seen had all pulled over, but I stubbornly pressed on. I was already halfway there, no point in turning back now. As the hours dragged by, my knuckles were white from gripping the wheel so hard. My back and shoulders ached from the tension. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The world outside my windshield was nothing but swirling white, punctuated by the occasional dark shape of a tree. I started to wonder if I was even on the road anymore. Suddenly my tires lost traction, and I felt the car start to slide sideways. My heart leapt into my throat as I tried to regain control, but it was useless. I spun once, twice, 3 times before coming to a stop, buried in a snowbank. For a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the howling wind outside. I tried to open my door, but several feet of snow had piled up against it. Panic started to set in as I realized how dire my situation was. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, in whiteout conditions, with no idea how far I was from civilization. My phone had no signal. I had some snacks and water, but not nearly enough if I got truly stuck out here. As the reality of my predicament sank in, I started to feel claustrophobic in the car. The snow was piling up around the windows, and I knew I needed to keep the exhaust pipe clear to avoid carbon monoxide poisoning. I managed to roll down the window and start digging myself out with my ice scraper. It was slow, exhausting work. The wind whipped snow into my face, and my fingers quickly went numb despite my gloves. After what felt like hours, I had cleared enough snow to open my door. I stumbled out into knee-deep snow, shielding my eyes against the stinging wind and snow. I circled the car, clearing snow from around the tires and exhaust. My clothes were soaked through, and I was shivering uncontrollably. Back in the relative warmth of the car, I tried to calm my racing thoughts. I could either stay put and hope someone found me, or try to dig the car out and keep moving. The thought of being trapped here indefinitely was terrifying, so I decided to try and get back on the road. It took several more exhausting rounds of digging and gunning the engine before I finally felt the tires gain traction. Relief washed over me as the car slowly crawled forward out of the snowbank. I was back on what I hoped was the road, creeping along at a snail's pace. The next few hours were a blur of white. I was beyond exhausted, my eyes strained from trying to see through the snow. Several times I nearly nodded off, jerking awake in terror. I talked to myself, sang, slapped my own face, anything to stay alert. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw a faint glow in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was a gas station. I could have cried with relief. I pulled in, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. For a moment I just sat there, overwhelmed with emotion. The gas station looked deserted, but the lights were on inside. I trudged through the snow to the door, praying it would be open. To my immense relief, it was. A little bell jingled as I entered, and warm air enveloped me. "Hello?" I called out. No response. The place seemed empty, but I was just grateful to be somewhere warm and dry. I grabbed some snacks and drinks, leaving cash on the counter. As I was warming my hands by the coffee machine, movement outside caught my eye. A figure was standing by my car, peering in the windows. My heart started racing. Who else would be out in this weather? I watched, frozen, as the person slowly circled my car, examining it closely. They were bundled up in dark winter gear, face obscured. Suddenly, they looked up and locked eyes with me through the window. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something unsettling about the way they stared at me, completely motionless. I don't know how long we stood there staring at each other. Finally, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the swirling snow. I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. What the hell was that about? I debated waiting out the storm here, but that creepy encounter had me on edge. This place suddenly felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. I decided to press on and try to reach my sister's house. Back on the road, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me. The snowy landscape started to feel menacing rather than peaceful. Every shadow looked like it could be hiding something sinister. The rest of the drive was a nightmare of paranoia and exhaustion. By the time I finally pulled into my sister's driveway, I was a complete wreck. She came running out, shocked to see me. "What are you doing here? Didn't you see the weather reports? The highways are all closed," she exclaimed. I broke down then, the stress of the day finally catching up with me. Through tears, I recounted the harrowing journey. My sister listened in horror, then hugged me tightly. "You could have died out there," she whispered. "Promise me you'll never do anything that reckless again." I nodded, still trembling. We went inside and she made me hot cocoa while I changed into dry clothes. As I started to warm up and calm down, the events of the day began to feel almost dreamlike. Had that strange encounter at the gas station really happened? Or had my exhausted mind been playing tricks on me? To this day, I'm not sure. But I do know that I'll never look at a snowy road the same way again. Every time I drive in winter weather, I find myself obsessively checking my mirrors. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I swear I see a dark figure watching me from the tree line. That birthday surprise turned into the scariest day of my life. I'm grateful I made it through, but the experience left me with a lingering sense of unease. The vast, empty whiteness of a blizzard now seems full of hidden dangers, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, that mysterious figure is still watching and waiting. I was so excited for our weekend trip to explore the frozen waterfalls. Zoe and I had been planning this adventure for weeks, poring over trail maps and weather forecasts. As we set out early that Friday morning, the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow on the snow-covered landscape. The drive up into the mountains was breathtaking. Towering evergreens lined the winding road, their branches heavy with fresh powder. Zoe and I chatted animatedly, sharing our hopes for the hikes ahead and debating which waterfalls would be the most spectacular when frozen. "I can't wait to get some amazing photos," Zoe gushed, patting her camera bag. "The ice formations are supposed to be unreal this time of year." I nodded in agreement, feeling a surge of excitement. "It's going to be incredible. I've never seen anything like it before." As we climbed higher into the mountains, the snow started coming down harder. Fat, wet flakes pelted the windshield, and I had to slow down considerably. The radio crackled with warnings of an approaching storm system, but we weren't too concerned. We were prepared with winter gear and supplies. Finally, we reached the trailhead for our first hike. Bundled up in layers, we set out on the snowy path. The forest was hushed, muffled by a thick blanket of snow. Our boots crunched with each step, the only sound besides our excited whispers. When we rounded a bend and caught our first glimpse of the frozen waterfall, we both gasped in awe. Massive pillars of ice clung to the rocky cliff face, glowing an ethereal blue in the weak winter sunlight. Delicate icicles hung like crystalline daggers. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," I breathed, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Zoe was already snapping photos, her camera clicking rapidly. We spent over an hour exploring the base of the falls, marveling at the intricate ice formations and reveling in the raw beauty of nature. As we hiked back to the car, fat snowflakes began swirling down again. The wind picked up, driving the snow sideways and stinging our exposed faces. By the time we reached the parking lot, visibility was severely limited. "Maybe we should find a place to wait out the storm," Zoe suggested, her voice muffled by her scarf. I nodded in agreement, my earlier excitement dampened by concern. The forecast hadn't called for a storm this severe. As I carefully navigated the winding mountain roads, the snow grew heavier and the wind howled. We'd only been driving for about 20 minutes when I spotted a sign for a rest stop ahead, Hollow Creek. With relief, I pulled off the main road and into the small parking lot. A few other cars were already there, their owners likely also seeking shelter from the storm. The rest stop was a weathered wooden building that had clearly seen better days. Paint peeled from the siding and icicles hung precariously from the eaves. But warm light glowed from the windows, a beacon in the swirling snow. Zoe and I hurried inside, stamping snow from our boots. The interior was rustic but cozy, with a crackling fireplace and the smell of coffee in the air. A few other travelers huddled at tables, looking as relieved as we felt to be out of the storm. We settled into a corner table with steaming cups of coffee, watching the snow pile up outside. As we scrolled through Zoe's photos from our hike, my unease began to fade. We were safe and warm, and the storm would likely pass soon. But as night fell and the storm showed no signs of letting up, a creeping sense of dread began to take hold. The rest stop was eerily quiet except for the howling wind outside. The other travelers had all left hours ago, braving the storm rather than stay the night. "Maybe we should try to find a hotel," Zoe suggested nervously. "This place is giving me the creeps." I was about to agree when movement outside caught my eye. Squinting through the frosty window, I saw a tall figure standing motionless in the parking lot, staring directly at our car. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Zoe," I whispered urgently, "look." She peered out the window and gasped softly. The figure hadn't moved, still fixated on our vehicle. As we watched, frozen in fear, he slowly raised one hand and pointed directly at us. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure Zoe could hear it. "What should we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the door to the rest stop creaked open. We both jumped, stifling screams. But it was just the elderly attendant who had served us coffee earlier. "You folks all right?" he asked, his weathered face creased with concern. "Storm's supposed to pass by morning. You're welcome to stay here tonight if you need." I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice steady. "Actually, sir, we were wondering about that man in the parking lot, the one staring at our car." The old man's expression darkened. He shuffled to the window and peered out into the swirling snow. After a long moment, he turned back to us with a grave look. "I don't see anyone out there," he said quietly. A chill ran through me. I looked back out the window, but the parking lot was empty. No sign of the threatening figure we'd both clearly seen. The attendant sighed heavily, sinking into a chair across from us. "Listen," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but strange things happen around here sometimes, especially on nights like this." Zoe and I exchanged uneasy glances as the old man continued. "Over the years there's been talk of travelers going missing in these parts, folks passing through never seen again. Some say it's just the harsh weather and treacherous roads, but others—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Others what?" I prompted, dreading the answer. The old man leaned in close. "Others say there's something out there in the woods, something that lures people off the road, into the darkness. Been going on for decades, long as I can remember." A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to dismiss it as local superstition, but the memory of that menacing figure in the parking lot was all too fresh. "Now, I can't say for certain what's true and what ain't," the attendant continued. "But I will say this. If I were you, I'd stay put till morning. Don't go wandering outside no matter what you might see or hear." With that ominous warning, He bid us good night and shuffled off to his small office in the back. Zoe and I were left alone in the dimly lit rest stop, the wind howling outside like a hungry beast. We spent a long, sleepless night huddled together on a worn couch, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. Several times I thought I saw movement outside the frosted windows, but I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my frightened imagination playing tricks. As the first gray light of dawn broke through the clouds, the storm finally began to subside. Zoe and I gathered our belongings with shaking hands, both of us eager to put as much distance between us and Hollow Creek as possible. The parking lot was buried under several feet of pristine snow, no footprints or any sign of the menacing figure from the night before. Our car was thankfully unharmed, though covered in a thick layer of ice and snow. As we prepared to leave, the old attendant emerged from the rest stop. He watched us silently as we cleared off the car, his expression unreadable. Just before we drove away, he approached my window. "Safe travels," he said gravely. "And remember, stick to the main roads. Don't let nothing or nobody tempt you off course." With a final nod, he turned and trudged back inside. Zoe and I exchanged uneasy glances as I carefully pulled out onto the snow-covered highway. For miles, we drove in tense silence, both processing the bizarre and frightening experience. The beautiful frozen waterfalls we'd come to see seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the chilling encounter at Hollow Creek. To this day, I'm not sure what really happened that night. Was the figure in the parking lot real, or just a trick of the storm? Were the old man's warnings based in truth, or simply local legends meant to scare tourists? All I know is that Zoe and I have never returned to that part of the mountains. Our weekend adventure left us with far more questions than answers, and a lingering sense of unease that I can't quite shake. Sometimes late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I'm transported back to that eerie rest stop, and I wonder what might be lurking just beyond the light, waiting in the darkness. I had been working non-stop for months, barely taking a day off as I climbed the corporate ladder. The stress was getting to me. I could feel it in my shoulders, my jaw, the constant headaches. When a co-worker mentioned a quaint mountain village that was perfect for a winter getaway, I impulsively booked a cabin for a week. I needed to escape, to decompress somewhere far from the city noise and endless emails. As I drove up winding mountain roads, watching the cityscape fade in my rearview mirror, I felt a weight lifting. The air got crisper, evergreens replaced office buildings. By the time I reached the village, nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, I was already breathing easier. The cabin was rustic but cozy, all knotty pine and crackling fireplace. That first evening I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, sipping hot cocoa and watching my breath form clouds in the frigid air. The silence was absolute. No car horns, no notifications pinging. Just the whisper of wind through pines. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next morning, I set out to explore the village. It was smaller than I expected, just a main street with a general store, diner, and a handful of local shops. Most seemed closed for the off-season. The few people I passed nodded politely, but kept walking. I got the sense outsiders weren't common here. I stopped into the diner for lunch, sliding into a booth by the window. As I waited for my food, I overheard snatches of conversation from the locals. They spoke in low voices about someone named Old Tom, who lived up the mountain, and how no one had seen him in weeks. There was talk of organizing a search party if he didn't show up soon. My food arrived and I dug in, savoring the hearty local fare. As I ate, I noticed an old man at the counter watching me. When I met his gaze, he quickly looked away. But a few minutes later, I caught him staring again. It was starting to make me uneasy. After finishing my meal, I decided to take a hike on one of the nearby trails. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I climbed steadily upwards. About an hour in, I rounded a bend and came face to face with a massive bull elk. We both froze, staring at each other. My heart pounded as I slowly backed away, praying it wouldn't charge. After what felt like hours, it snorted and ambled off into the trees. I hurried back down the trail, shaken by the encounter. That night, a storm rolled in. Wind howled around the cabin, rattling the windows. I huddled by the fire with a book, trying to lose myself in the pages. But I kept glancing nervously at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. The next few days passed in a blur of hikes, naps by the fire, and quiet meals. I began to settle into the rhythm of this slower pace of life. But an undercurrent of unease remained. The villagers still kept their distance, exchanging significant looks when they saw me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I ventured outside. On my 5th day, I decided to hike to a nearby waterfall. The trail was more challenging than I expected, with steep switchbacks and icy patches. About halfway there, I heard what sounded like footsteps crunching in the snow behind me. I whirled around, but saw nothing. Unnerved, I picked up my pace. The waterfall was breathtaking, a sheet of ice with water still flowing beneath. As I stood admiring it, movement caught my eye. A figure stood watching me from the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It was the old man from the diner. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he called out, his voice gravelly. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He came closer, and I fought the urge to back away. "You're the city fella staying in the Miller cabin," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," I managed. "Just here for a little vacation." He grunted. "Folks don't usually come here in winter. Too isolated for most." "I like the quiet," I said. He studied me for a long moment. "Quiet can be dangerous, makes a man think too much, or not enough." With that cryptic statement, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I stood there for several minutes, heart racing. What did he mean? Was it a warning? A threat? I hurried back down the trail, constantly looking over my shoulder. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I began to wonder if coming here alone had been a mistake. The isolation that had seemed so appealing now felt oppressive, dangerous even. The next morning I woke to find several inches of fresh snow blanketing everything. As I sipped my coffee on the porch, movement in the trees caught my eye. A dark shape darted between the pines. I squinted, trying to make it out. Was it a person? An animal? Whatever it was gone in an instant. I spent that day in the cabin, too unnerved to venture out. I tried to distract myself with books and movies, but my mind kept wandering. Why did the villagers act so strangely around me? Who was old Tom, and why hadn't anyone seen him? What was the old man from the diner trying to tell me? As night fell, the silence became overwhelming. I found myself talking out loud just to hear a human voice. I knew I was being irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong here. Just after midnight, a scream pierced the night. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. It came again, long and anguished. It seemed to be coming from the woods behind the cabin. I debated what to do. Should I go investigate? Call for help? As I wavered, the screaming abruptly stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn finally broke, I packed my bags with shaking hands. I needed to get out of here. As I loaded up my car, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow leading from the woods to my cabin. They weren't mine. I peeled out of there, tires spinning on the icy road. As I drove out of the village, I passed a sheriff's car heading the other way, lights flashing. In my rearview mirror, I saw it turn onto the road leading to my cabin. Even now, months later, I'm not sure what happened in that mountain village. Was I just an outsider jumping at shadows? Or was there something sinister going on? I've tried researching the area, but found very little information. It's as if the village barely exists. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of that scream echoing in my ears. And I know it was real, whatever it was. I thought I was going there to escape the pressures of modern life. Instead, I found that true isolation can be far more terrifying than any city street. We need connection, even fleeting interactions with strangers, to feel human. Without it, the mind can play tricks on you, or maybe it reveals truths we'd rather not see. Either way, I won't be taking any solo trips to remote villages again anytime soon. Some forms of escape come at too high a price. We set out early on a crisp Friday morning, the car packed with hiking gear, warm clothes, and snacks. The first few hours of the drive were filled with laughter and anticipation. Zoe's playlist of indie folk music provided the perfect soundtrack as we watched the urban landscape gradually give way to snow-covered forests and mountains. Our first stop was at a scenic overlook. The view was breathtaking, a vast expanse of white-capped peaks stretching as far as the eye could see. We took some photos, had a snowball fight, and felt like kids again. It was exactly the carefree start we'd hoped for. As we continued our journey, the weather began to change. What started as light snowfall quickly intensified. Within an hour, we found ourselves in the middle of a full-blown blizzard. Visibility dropped to near zero, and I could feel the car struggling against the wind. "Maybe we should find somewhere to wait this out," Zoe suggested, concern evident in her voice. I nodded, squinting to see through the windshield. "Yeah, good idea. There's got to be a rest stop or something around here." After what felt like an eternity of crawling along the highway, we spotted a sign for Hollow Creek Rest Area, next exit. Relief washed over us as I carefully navigated the exit ramp. The rest area was little more than a small building with restrooms, a vending machine, and a covered parking area. As I pulled into a spot, I noticed we were the only car there. The isolation, which had seemed charming earlier in the day, now felt eerie. "I'll go check if there's any info about the storm," I told Zoe, zipping up my jacket. She grabbed my arm. "Be careful. This place gives me the creeps." I smiled reassuringly, but as I stepped out into the howling wind, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The rest area building was dark and locked. A sign on the door read, "Closed for maintenance," though it looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. Frustrated, I turned back towards the car. That's when I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the parking lot, partially obscured by the swirling snow. At first, I thought it might be another traveler seeking shelter. But as I watched, I realized he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring in our direction. My heart began to race. I quickened my pace back to the car, trying to keep the figure in my peripheral vision without looking directly at him. As I got closer, I could see Zoe's face through the windshield, her eyes wide with fear. I yanked the door open and practically dove inside. "We need to go, now." "What's wrong?" Zoe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, she gasped. I followed her gaze to see the figure had moved closer. He was now standing just a few parking spaces away, his features still indistinct in the snow and fading light. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. As I shifted into reverse, the figure took a step towards us. "Go, go, go!" Zoe urged, her panic mirroring my own. I slammed on the gas, the tires spinning in the snow before finding purchase. As we fishtailed out of the parking lot, I caught one last glimpse of the figure in the rearview mirror. He hadn't moved, but I swear I could feel his eyes boring into us as we sped away. We drove in tense silence for several miles, both of us too shaken to speak. The storm seemed to intensify around us, as if trying to force us back to that God-forsaken rest stop. Finally, we saw lights ahead, a small town that wasn't on our original route. At this point, we didn't care. We just needed to be around other people. The town, if you could call it that, consisted of a gas station, a diner, and a handful of houses. We pulled into the gas station, both of us exhaling in relief at the sight of other cars and people. "I'll fill up the tank," I said, my voice still shaky. "Why don't you go inside and see if you can find out how long this storm is supposed to last?" Zoe nodded, wrapping her scarf tightly around her face before venturing out into the cold. As I stood there pumping gas, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every gust of wind made me jump, half expecting to see that mysterious figure materialize out of the snow. Zoe returned a few minutes later, her face pale. "We need to talk," she said, climbing back into the car. Once inside, she turned to me with a grave expression. "I overheard the cashier talking to someone on the phone. They were discussing another disappearance." My blood ran cold. "Disappearance?" Zoe nodded. "Apparently, it's not the first. The cashier said something about another one at Hollow Creek." "That's where we just were, right?" I felt my chest tighten. Did you tell them what we saw?" "No," Zoe replied, shaking her head. "I don't know why, but something told me to keep quiet. The way they were talking, it was like they were more annoyed than concerned, like it was a regular occurrence." We sat in stunned silence for a moment, the implications of what Zoe had overheard sinking in. "We should tell someone," I finally said. "The police, or—" "Tell them what?" Zoe interrupted. "That we saw a creepy guy standing in the snow? We don't even know if he was real or if our minds were playing tricks on us because of the storm." She had a point, but it didn't make me feel any better. "Let's just get out of here," I said, starting the engine. "We can find a hotel in the next big town and figure out what to do in the morning." As we pulled out of the gas station, I couldn't help but notice the cashier watching us from the window. There was something in his gaze that made my skin crawl. The next few hours were a blur of white knuckle driving through the relentless storm. We barely spoke, both lost in our own thoughts about what had happened and what could have happened at Hollow Creek. It was well past midnight when we finally found a motel with a vacancy. As we checked in, I caught Zoe staring out the lobby window, her body tense. "What is it?" I asked, following her gaze. "Nothing," she said quickly. "I just thought I saw— Never mind. I'm just tired." But as we made our way to our room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the quiet night. Inside our room, we double-checked the locks and drew the curtains tight. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we were both terrified. "Do you think we're overreacting?" Zoe asked as we lay in our separate beds, both too wired to sleep. I wanted to say yes, to reassure her that it was all in our heads. But the image of that figure in the snow, the overheard conversation about disappearances, the cashier's unsettling gaze, it all felt too real. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I think our fun weekend getaway is over. First thing in the morning, we're heading home." Zoe murmured in agreement. and soon I heard her breathing even out as she fell into an uneasy sleep. I lay awake for hours, jumping at every creak and groan of the old motel. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and endless snow. We left at dawn, both of us eager to put as much distance between us and Hollow Creek as possible. The storm had passed, leaving behind a deceptively beautiful winter landscape, but neither of us could appreciate it now. The drive home was subdued, our earlier excitement replaced by a lingering sense of unease. We tried to rationalize what had happened, to convince ourselves it was all just a product of bad weather and overactive imaginations. But deep down, we both knew something wasn't right. In the weeks that followed, I obsessively searched for news about Hollow Creek and the surrounding area. I found a few vague mentions of missing hikers and travelers over the years, but nothing concrete. It was as if the place barely existed. Zoe and I don't talk about that day much anymore. We've drifted apart, our shared experience creating a rift rather than bringing us closer. Sometimes I wonder if she blames me for taking us on that trip, for putting us in danger. But on cold, snowy nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I can't help but think about that figure at Hollow Creek. And I wonder, if we had stayed just a little longer, would we have become another statistic, another mysterious disappearance in a place that seems to swallow people whole? I may never know the truth about what happened that day, but one thing's for certain, I'll never look at a snowy landscape the same way again. What was once beautiful now holds a potential for terror that I can never unsee. And somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. I was so excited to surprise my sister for her birthday. We have this tradition where I visit her every year, no matter what. This time, though, I probably should have listened to the weather warnings. But you know how it is. When you've got your mind set on something, it's hard to let go. The drive started off okay. Sure, it was snowing, but I've driven in worse. Or so I thought. I had my trusty SUV, a full tank of gas, and a thermos of hot coffee. What could go wrong? About 2 hours in, things started getting dicey. The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see the road. My windshield wipers were working overtime, and I had to slow down to a crawl. But I kept going. I mean, I'd already come this far, right? Then it happened. The GPS started glitching. At first it was just small hiccups, but then it went completely haywire. It was telling me to turn onto roads that didn't exist, or worse, off cliffs. I tried using my phone's map app, but the signal was weak and kept cutting out. I figured I'd stop at the next gas station to ask for directions and maybe wait out the storm. That's when I saw the lights of a small truck stop through the blizzard. I breathed a sigh of relief and pulled in. The place looked deserted except for one big rig parked off to the side. I went inside, shaking off the snow. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting an eerie glow. There was no one at the counter, so I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" That's when I heard heavy footsteps from the back. A tall, burly man with a thick beard emerged from the stockroom. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with these intense, dark eyes. Hi, I said, trying to sound casual. "Could you tell me how to get to Millbrook from here? My GPS is acting up." He kept staring, then slowly shook his head. "Ain't no way to Millbrook in this weather. Roads are all closed." My heart sank. "But I have to get there. It's my sister's birthday." He let out a low chuckle that sent chills down my spine. "Well, ain't that sweet? But trust me, you don't want to be out there tonight." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I thanked him quickly and hurried back to my car. As I was pulling out, I saw him watching me from the window. I could have sworn he was smiling. Back on the road, visibility was even worse. The snow was so thick it felt like I was driving through a white wall. I couldn't see any other cars, no road signs, nothing. Just an endless expanse of white. That's when I noticed the headlights behind me. At first, I was relieved. Another car meant I wasn't alone out here. But then I realized the lights weren't getting any closer or falling behind. They were maintaining the exact same distance. I sped up a little. So did the lights. I slowed down. The lights slowed too. My heart started racing. Was I just being paranoid? Maybe it was someone else trying to navigate through this mess, using my taillights as a guide. But then I remembered the truck at the gas station. The way that man had looked at me. No, this couldn't be a coincidence. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was overreacting. But every time I checked my rearview mirror, those lights were there, never wavering. Suddenly, my tire hit a patch of ice. The car started to spin. I gripped the wheel, trying to regain control, but it was useless. I ended up in a snowbank on the side of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. The headlights behind me stopped. I heard the sound of a car door opening and closing. Footsteps crunching in the snow, getting closer. I was trapped. My car was stuck, and someone was approaching. I fumbled for my phone, but of course, there was no signal. The footsteps got louder. Then, a knock on my window. I jumped, letting out a small scream. Through the frosted glass, I could make out the silhouette of a person. Slowly, I rolled down the window, just a crack. "You okay in there?" It wasn't the man from the gas station. It was a woman's voice, concerned and friendly. Relief washed over me. I think so," I stammered. "Just slid off the road." She nodded. "It's treacherous out here. I've been following your taillights for a while now. Figured it was safer than trying to navigate on my own. Want some help getting out?" I felt ridiculous. All that fear and paranoia, and it was just another driver trying to stay safe. With her help, we managed to get my car back on the road. She offered to lead the way since she knew the area better, and I gratefully accepted. We drove for another hour, the storm finally starting to let up. As we approached Millbrook, she flashed her lights and turned off onto a side road. I wanted to thank her, but she was gone before I could. I made it to my sister's place just after midnight. She was shocked to see me, having assumed I'd cancel due to the weather. As I hugged her tight, I felt the last of the tension leave my body. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of that night. Every time I get in my car for a long trip, I find myself constantly checking the rearview mirror. The rational part of my brain knows it was all just a combination of bad weather and an overactive imagination. But there's still a small voice in the back of my mind that whispers, "What if?" I don't know if I'll ever feel completely at ease on the road again, especially in winter. That night changed something in me. It taught me that sometimes the real danger isn't what's actually out there, but what our minds can conjure up in moments of fear and isolation. I still visit my sister every year for her birthday, but now I always check the weather forecast. And I always make sure I have a full tank of gas before I leave. I was so excited for our winter getaway to Silver Peak. My best friend Leah and I had been planning this trip for months, desperate to escape the stress and chaos of city life for a few days. As we packed up my old Subaru on that frigid Friday morning, the air was crisp and the sky a brilliant blue. It felt like the perfect start to our adventure. The first couple hours on the road were amazing. We cranked up our favorite playlist, singing along at the top of our lungs and laughing about ridiculous inside jokes. I felt lighter than I had in ages, like I was finally shrugging off the weight of deadlines and expectations that had been crushing me. About 3 hours in, we stopped at a small diner for lunch. As we were leaving, I noticed a young woman standing by the side of the road with her thumb out. She looked to be in her early 20s, with long, dark hair and an oversized army jacket. "Should we give her a ride?" Leah asked hesitantly. I'll admit, I was torn. Growing up, my parents had drilled into me to never pick up hitchhikers. But it was freezing out, and the girl looked harmless enough. Plus, I reasoned, there were 2 of us, and only 1 of her. What could go wrong? "Yeah, let's do it," I said with a shrug. "It's too cold to leave her out here." We pulled over, and the girl jogged up to the car with a grateful smile. "Thank you so much," she said as she climbed into the back seat. "I'm Anna." At first, everything seemed fine. Anna was quiet but polite, answering our questions about where she was headed, just up the mountain a ways, and why she was traveling alone, visiting family. But as the miles ticked by, I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. It was little things at first. The way Anna's eyes would dart around nervously, how she'd sometimes mutter under her breath when she thought we couldn't hear, the fact that she kept fidgeting with something in her jacket pocket. About an hour after we'd picked her up, Leah asked if we could stop at the next rest area. As Anna got out to use the restroom, I noticed she'd left her backpack on the seat. I know it was wrong, but something compelled me to take a quick peek inside. My blood ran cold when I saw a large hunting knife nestled among her belongings. When Anna returned, I tried to act normal, but my mind was racing. Why would she need a knife that big? Was she planning to hurt us? I caught Leah's eye, trying to silently communicate my concern, but she just gave me a confused look. The tension in the car was palpable as we continued driving. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, hyper-aware of every movement Anna made in the back seat. The beautiful scenery flying by outside the windows now seemed ominous and foreboding. We were about 30 minutes from Silver Peak when Anna suddenly asked us to pull over. "This is my stop," she said quietly. "Thank you for the ride." Relief flooded through me as she gathered her things and stepped out onto the snowy shoulder. But as we pulled away, that relief quickly turned to dread. In the rearview mirror, I saw Anna standing perfectly still, watching our car disappear down the winding mountain road. The look in her eyes sent chills down my spine. When we finally reached our cabin, I was a nervous wreck. I kept replaying the whole encounter in my mind, second-guessing every interaction. Had I imagined the knife? Was I just being paranoid? Leah tried to reassure me, but I could tell she was unsettled too. We did our best to shake off the weird vibes and enjoy our first night, cooking dinner and opening a bottle of wine. But I couldn't fully relax, jumping at every little noise outside. The next morning, we decided to head into town to explore and pick up some groceries. As I went to start the car, my heart nearly stopped. There, tucked under the windshield wiper, was a folded piece of paper. With shaking hands, I unfolded it to reveal a short message scrawled in messy handwriting. "Thanks for the ride. Sorry I couldn't stay longer. Maybe next time. A." I showed it to Leah, and we both stood there in stunned silence. How had Anna known where we were staying? Had she followed us? And what did she mean by next time? We debated calling the police, but what would we even say? Nothing had actually happened, and we had no proof of any wrongdoing. In the end, we decided to cut our trip short and head home early. The whole drive back, I was a nervous wreck, constantly checking the rearview mirror and imagining I saw Anna's face in every passing car. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling of unease. I keep wondering who Anna really was and what her intentions were. Was she just an odd but harmless traveler, or something much more sinister? The rational part of my brain says I'm overreacting, but I can't help but feel like we narrowly escaped something terrible. I've sworn off picking up hitchhikers for good, and Leah and I have agreed to be much more cautious on future road trips. But late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I still find myself thinking about Anna. I can't help but wonder if she's out there somewhere, thumb out on the side of the road, waiting for her next ride. And I pray that whoever picks her up makes it to their destination safely. The whole experience has left me shaken and questioning my judgment. I used to pride myself on being a good judge of character, but now I'm not so sure. It's a harsh reminder that you can never truly know a stranger's intentions, no matter how harmless they might seem. I've tried to rationalize it all away. Maybe Anna was just a socially awkward person who happened to carry a knife for protection. Maybe the note was just her awkward way of saying thanks. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that we brushed up against something truly dangerous that day. Leah and I have talked about it endlessly, trying to make sense of what happened. We've gone over every detail, every interaction, looking for clues we might have missed. But in the end, we're left with more questions than answers. I find myself obsessively checking the local news, half expecting to see a story about a dangerous hitchhiker in the area. But there's never anything. It's like Anna vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but that cryptic note and a lingering sense of dread. I know it probably sounds crazy to be this shaken up over what was essentially an uneventful car ride, but I can't explain the visceral fear I felt in that moment when I saw the knife, or the way my skin crawled when I read that note. It was like some primal part of my brain recognized a predator in our midst, even if I couldn't consciously put my finger on why. The whole experience has made me hyper-vigilant. I'm constantly on edge now, always looking over my shoulder and second-guessing my interactions with strangers. I hate feeling this way, but I can't seem to shake it. I've thought about seeking therapy to help process everything, but I'm worried they'll just tell me I'm overreacting. And maybe I am. But I can't shake the feeling that Leah and I came very close to becoming a cautionary tale that day. For now, I'm trying to focus on moving forward and not letting this experience control my life. But I know I'll never forget Anna, or the way her eyes looked in that rearview mirror as we drove away. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if she's out there somewhere, thinking about us too. And that thought terrifies me more than anything. I was in desperate need of a break from the chaos of city life. The constant noise, the endless stream of people, and the suffocating pressure of work had left me feeling drained and disconnected. So when I stumbled upon an advertisement for a quaint mountain village nestled in the heart of a picturesque winter wonderland, I knew it was exactly what I needed. Without much thought, I booked a cabin for a week-long solo getaway. The drive up to the mountains was breathtaking. As I wound my way along the snow-covered roads, towering evergreens flanked either side, their branches heavy with pristine white snow. The further I drove, the more I felt the weight of my everyday worries melting away. This was going to be the perfect escape. I arrived at the village just as the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the snow-capped rooftops. The main street was lined with charming wooden buildings, their windows glowing with warm light. I couldn't help but smile as I made my way to my rental cabin, feeling a sense of excitement and adventure bubbling up inside me. The cabin was everything I had hoped for, cozy, rustic, and secluded. I spent the first couple of days exploring the village, hiking nearby trails, and simply reveling in the peace and quiet. It was exactly the reset I needed. On the third day, I decided to venture a bit further out. There was a scenic overlook about an hour's drive away that promised stunning views of the surrounding mountain range. I packed some snacks, grabbed my camera, and hit the road, eager for a new adventure. The drive started off pleasant enough. The roads were clear despite the recent snowfall, and I found myself humming along to the radio, perfectly content. About halfway to my destination, the weather began to change. The sky darkened ominously, and fat snowflakes started to fall. Within minutes, it had turned into a full-blown blizzard. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white as I strained to see through the whiteout conditions. The road ahead was barely visible, and I found myself second-guessing every turn. Just as I was considering turning back, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I was relieved. Another vehicle on the road meant I wasn't completely alone out here. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized the truck behind me wasn't passing or falling back. It maintained a constant distance, close enough that I could make out the outline of a large pickup through the swirling snow. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just as nervous about the weather as I was, and felt safer following another vehicle. But something about the situation felt off. I spotted a turnoff ahead and decided to pull over, hoping the truck would pass. To my growing alarm, it pulled in right behind me. My heart began to race as I watched in my mirrors, waiting for someone to get out or drive away. Nothing happened. The truck just sat there, engine idling, headlights illuminating the inside of my car. Panic started to set in. I was alone on a remote mountain road in the middle of a blizzard, being followed by a mysterious vehicle. Every worst-case scenario I'd ever heard flashed through my mind. With shaking hands, I put my car back in drive and pulled out, praying the truck wouldn't follow. But it did. For the next hour, I drove aimlessly through the storm, taking random turns in an attempt to lose my pursuer. But no matter what I did, those headlights remained firmly fixed in my rearview mirror. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally, but fear had taken hold. Tears streamed down my face as I realized how vulnerable I was out here. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, my fuel light came on. The frantic driving had drained my tank faster than I'd realized. Now I was faced with an impossible choice: risk running out of gas in the middle of nowhere, or stop and potentially face whoever was in that truck. As if answering my silent prayers, I spotted a sign for a rest stop ahead. It wasn't ideal, but at least it might have people around. I made a split-second decision and took the exit, my pursuer following close behind. The rest stop was deserted when I pulled in, save for a single semi-truck parked in the far corner. I parked as close to the main building as possible, killed the engine, and sat there, paralyzed with fear. The truck pulled in a few spaces away, its headlights still trained on my car. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the driver's side door of the truck opened. A tall figure emerged, followed by another from the passenger side. They were both men, dressed in dark winter gear that obscured their features. They began walking towards my car. I was trapped. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. Should I try to drive away, scream for help? As the men drew closer, I noticed something in one of their hands. Was that a knife? Just then, a blinding light cut through the darkness, accompanied by the roar of an engine. A snowplow burst into the parking lot, its flashing lights and loud engine shattering the eerie silence. The two men quickly retreated to their truck and peeled out of the parking lot, disappearing into the night. I sat there, shaking uncontrollably, as the snowplow driver approached my car. He was an older man with a kind face, concern etched in his features as he asked if I was all right. Through sobs, I managed to explain what had happened. He listened patiently, then offered to escort me back to the village. The drive back was a blur. I followed the comforting, flashing lights of the snowplow, jumping at every shadow and set of headlights I saw. When we finally reached the village, I thanked the driver profusely, my voice still shaky. I spent the rest of my trip holed up in my cabin, too terrified to venture out again. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind had me on edge. When it was finally time to leave, I drove home with a newfound appreciation for the safety of my boring city life. To this day, I don't know who those men were or what they wanted. The local police found no evidence when I reported the incident, and I was left with nothing but my own terrifying memories. I still love to travel, but I'm much more cautious now. I always make sure someone knows where I am. I avoid remote locations, and I never ever drive alone at night in unfamiliar places. That trip was supposed to be an escape from stress, a chance to reset and find peace. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life, a harsh reminder of how quickly a dream vacation can turn into a nightmare. The mountains may be beautiful, but they hold secrets and dangers I never want to encounter again. It was supposed to be a relaxing winter getaway, just me and my loyal German Shepherd Bear, heading up to a remote cabin in the mountains for some peace and quiet. I had been feeling burnt out from work lately, and thought a few days of solitude in nature would do me good. The drive started out great. We left early in the morning before sunrise. Bear was excited, his tail wagging as he stuck his head out the window to catch the crisp winter air. The roads were clear as we made our way out of the city and into more rural areas. I had my favorite playlist going and was feeling optimistic about the trip. As we started climbing higher into the mountains, snow began to fall. At first it was just light flurries, but it quickly turned into a heavy snowstorm. The wind picked up, blowing snow across the road and severely limiting visibility. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I navigated the winding mountain roads. Bear seemed to sense my tension. He moved to the front passenger seat and rested his head on my leg, as if to reassure me. I patted his head, grateful for his comforting presence. "We'll be okay, buddy," I told him. "The cabin isn't much farther." That's when I saw him, a lone figure trudging through the snow on the side of the road. He was hunched over against the wind, a bright red scarf, the only splash of color visible through the white haze of snow. I hesitated, wondering if I should stop. It didn't seem safe for someone to be out walking in this weather. As I got closer, the man turned and stuck out his thumb, signaling for a ride. I pulled over, rolling down my window. "Hey there, do you need a lift?" I called out. The man hurried over, his face mostly obscured by the red scarf. "Oh, thank you," he said, his voice muffled. "My car broke down a few miles back. I've been walking for hours trying to find help." I glanced at Bear, who was eyeing the stranger warily. Something about the dog's posture made me uneasy. Bear is usually very friendly, but he seemed on edge. Still, I couldn't just leave someone stranded in a blizzard. "Hop in the back," I said. "I can take you to the next town." The man climbed in, and I immediately regretted my decision. An overwhelming smell of wet wool and something else I couldn't identify, something unpleasant, filled the car. Bear started whining softly. "Don't mind the dog," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "He's harmless. I'm John, by the way." "Nice to meet you, John. I'm Jack," the man replied after a slight pause. I found it odd that he hesitated on his own name. We drove in awkward silence for a while. I tried making small talk, asking Jack where he was headed, but he gave only vague responses. The unease I felt earlier grew stronger. Bear remained alert, his ears pricked forward and his eyes fixed on our passenger. About 20 minutes later, I spotted a gas station up ahead, a welcome sight in the middle of nowhere. "Look, we can stop there and see if they can help with your car," I said, relieved to have a reason to end this uncomfortable ride. As I pulled into the gas station, something struck me as off. Despite the raging storm, there were no other cars around. The lights were on inside the small convenience store, but I couldn't see anyone moving around. It was as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry. I parked near the front door, leaving the engine running. "I'll go see if anyone's inside," I told Jack. "Feel free to use my phone if you need to call someone." I handed him my cell phone, then turned to Bear. "Stay," I commanded firmly. He whined in response but remained in his seat. As I stepped out of the car, the full force of the storm hit me. The wind howled, driving icy particles of snow into my face. I hunched my shoulders and quickly made my way to the store entrance. The door was unlocked, so I hurried inside, stamping snow from my boots. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone here?" No response. The store was warm and brightly lit, but completely empty. Shelves were fully stocked, the coffee machine was on, even the slushy machine was running. But there wasn't a soul in sight. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Something was very wrong here. I turned to leave and froze in my tracks. There, on the floor near the door, was a set of wet footprints. But they weren't normal footprints. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own feet, and oddly shaped. They led from the door to behind the counter, where they simply stopped. My heart racing, I bolted for the door. As I reached for the handle, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Wait, my phone? I had given it to Jack. I pulled it out, my hands shaking. There was a new text message from an unknown number. "Don't trust the red scarf." I sprinted back to my car, my mind reeling. What the hell was going on? As I approached the vehicle, I realized with growing horror that it was empty. Both Bear and Jack were gone. "Bear!" I shouted, my voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Bear, where are you?" I heard a faint bark in response, coming from behind the gas station. Without thinking, I ran towards the sound, calling Bear's name. As I rounded the corner of the building, I skidded to a stop. There was Bear, hackles raised, growling at Jack. But Jack wasn't Jack anymore. The red scarf lay discarded on the ground, and the figure before me was like something out of a nightmare. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long and bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was a sickly grayish white, almost blending in with the snow. And its face, God, its face. Where there should have been features, there was just smooth, blank skin, with only a gash-like mouth filled with sharp, jagged teeth. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as the creature slowly turned its featureless face towards me. That gash of a mouth opened wider and wider until it split the entire head in half. A sound emerged, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between that made my bones vibrate. Bear's barking snapped me out of my terrified trance. "Bear, come!" I yelled, already turning to run. I heard the scramble of paws on snow as Bear bounded after me. We raced back to the car, the inhuman screaming growing louder behind us. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. Get in, I urged Bear, practically shoving him into the passenger seat. I jammed the key into the ignition and gunned the engine, tires squealing as we fishtailed out of the gas station. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a tall, misshapen figure emerging from behind the building, moving with an unnatural loping gait. I drove like a madman down the mountain. heedless of the treacherous road conditions. Bear whined and pawed at me, but I couldn't spare a moment to comfort him. My only thought was to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. It wasn't until we reached the bottom of the mountain, where the snow had turned to rain, that I finally slowed down. My hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, and I was drenched in cold sweat. Bear nuzzled my arm, and I patted him absently, my mind still reeling from what we'd just experienced. I drove straight home, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed. Once inside my apartment, I locked and bolted the door, then sank to the floor, my back against it. Bear curled up next to me, his warm presence providing some small comfort. It's been 3 days now, and I still can't make sense of what happened. I've scoured the internet for information about that gas station, about strange encounters in those mountains, but I've found nothing concrete. Just vague stories and legends that sound crazy, almost as crazy as what I experienced. I keep replaying it all in my mind, wondering if there was something I missed, some explanation that would make it all make sense. But every time I close my eyes, I see that blank face, that grotesque mouth. I hear that bone-chilling scream. Bear hasn't left my side since we got back. He seems more protective than ever, growling at shadows and unexpected noises. I'm grateful for his company. I don't think I could bear to be alone right now. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened up there in the mountains. Part of me wants to go back, to investigate further and prove to myself that it was all just some sort of hallucination or misunderstanding. But a bigger part of me never wants to set foot in those mountains again. For now, I'm staying put, trying to convince myself that it's over, that we're safe. But late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I can't help but wonder, is it really over? Or is that thing still out there, wearing its human disguise, waiting for another unsuspecting traveler to offer it a ride? I don't have any answers, only questions that haunt me. All I know is that I'll never look at a red scarf the same way again. And the next time my instincts, or my dog, tell me something's not right, I'll listen. Some strangers are better left on the side of the road.